Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Wilbur Kowalski had been hauling freight up and down Interstate 95 for 17 years when he stopped at that truck stop outside Savannah, Georgia. It was a Tuesday evening in late September 2019, and the autumn air carried just enough chill to make him grateful for the coffee he'd been nursing since Jacksonville. His Peterbilt 389 purred like a contented cat as he guided her into the Flying J, the familiar weight of 40,000 pounds of electronics settling behind him with a satisfied hiss of air brakes. The truck stop was one of those sprawling complexes that had sprouted along I-95 like mechanical flowers, complete with diesel pumps, a convenience store, and a 24-hour diner that advertised home cooking just like Mama's in neon letters that flickered with electrical arthritis. Wilbur had eaten at hundreds of similar places over the years, and they all blended together into a comforting sameness of vinyl booths, laminated menus, and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the Clinton administration. He'd been making this run from Miami to Baltimore every other week for the past 3 years, and his body had settled into the rhythm of it. Wake up at 4 a.m. in his one-bedroom apartment in Hialeah, grab a Cuban coffee and a buttered roll from the place on the corner where the old lady always asked about his mother, then hit the road by 5:30 to beat the worst of the Miami traffic. The route was burned into his muscle memory. I-95 north through Fort Lauderdale, past the Kennedy Space Center, through Jacksonville, into Georgia, then the Carolinas, Virginia, and finally Maryland. Wilbur was 53 years old, divorced twice, with grown kids who called maybe twice a year and always seemed to need money. He'd started driving trucks after his second marriage fell apart, and his job at the Ford plant in Michigan disappeared along with half the manufacturing jobs in Detroit. The road had become his sanctuary, the cab of his Peterbilt more home than any apartment he'd rented in the past decade. That particular Tuesday had been routine in every way. He'd picked up his load at a distribution center in Doral at 6 a.m., signed the paperwork without reading it, and pulled onto the highway just as the sun was starting to paint the Miami skyline gold. The traffic had been surprisingly light for a weekday, and he'd made good time through Florida and most of Georgia. His CB radio had crackled with the usual chatter, weather reports, speed trap warnings, jokes that weren't particularly funny but passed the time anyway. The truck stop appeared on his right like a mirage of fluorescent lighting and diesel fumes. Wilbur had been driving for 9 hours straight, which put him right at the federal limit for continuous operation. He needed food, a shower, and 10 hours of mandatory rest before he could legally get back on the road. The GPS on his dashboard showed he was making good time. If he got back on the road by 6 a.m. tomorrow, he'd reach Baltimore with hours to spare before his Thursday morning delivery window. He maneuvered his rig into one of the angled parking spaces designed for trucks, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. Through his windshield, he could see other drivers moving through the complex like tired ghosts, some heading into the diner, others emerging from the shower facility with damp hair and clean clothes. A few sat in lawn chairs beside their trucks, smoking cigarettes and staring at their phones in the blue glow of small screens. The diner was busier than he'd expected for 8 p.m. on a Tuesday. Maybe a dozen truckers occupied various booths and counter stools, along with a few regular folks who looked like they were just passing through on their way to somewhere more important. The hostess was nowhere to be seen, so Wilbur chose an empty booth near the window where he could keep an eye on his truck. The vinyl seat had been repaired with silver duct tape that stuck to his jeans, and the table wobbled slightly when he leaned his elbows on it. A waitress approached with a coffee pot and a tired smile. Her name tag read Opal, and she looked like she'd been working there since the place opened. Her gray hair was pulled back in a ponytail that revealed roots that needed touching up, and her uniform, a powder blue dress with white trim, had the lived-in quality of something that had survived countless washing machine cycles. She was probably in her early 60s, with the kind of sturdy build that suggested she'd been on her feet for most of her adult life. "Coffee, hun?" she asked, already turning over the white ceramic mug beside his water glass. "Please," Wilbur said, pushing the mug toward her. "And a menu if you don't mind." Opal poured the coffee with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd repeated this motion thousands of times, then pulled a laminated menu from the pile under her arm. "Kitchen's got a special tonight," she said, setting the menu in front of him. "Meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans. Comes with a roll and butter, most popular thing we serve." Wilbur glanced at the menu, but it was the same collection of American diner standards he'd seen everywhere else. Burgers, sandwiches, fried chicken, various combinations of eggs and breakfast meat available all day. The prices were reasonable, the descriptions straightforward. Nothing fancy, nothing that would challenge anyone's palate or digestive system. "The meatloaf sounds good," he said, handing the menu back to her. "And maybe some pie if you've got it." "Apple, cherry, or pecan," Opal said, jotting notes on her order pad with a pencil worn down to a stub. "All made fresh this morning. Apple, with ice cream if you have it." She nodded and headed toward the kitchen, her white sneakers squeaking slightly against the linoleum floor. Wilbur sipped his coffee and watched the other diners. At the counter, a thin man in coveralls was working his way through what looked like a double cheeseburger, occasionally making comments to the woman beside him who was picking at a salad. Two truckers in a booth across the restaurant were deep in conversation about load rates and fuel prices, their voices carrying the particular cadence of men who spent most of their time alone. The coffee was better than he'd expected, hot, strong, and recently brewed. Wilbur allowed himself to relax for the first time in hours, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders as the caffeine began to work its way through his system. This was one of the simple pleasures of life on the road, finding a decent cup of coffee at the end of a long day, sitting in a clean, well-lit place where nobody expected anything from you except payment for services rendered. Opal returned about 15 minutes later with his dinner. The meatloaf was a thick slab of ground beef held together with what looked like breadcrumbs and egg, covered in a brown gravy that smelled like childhood memories. The mashed potatoes were real, not the instant kind. He could tell by the slightly lumpy texture and the way they held their shape on the plate. The green beans were probably from a can, but they'd been seasoned with bacon grease and onions in a way that made them taste homemade. "Looks perfect," Wilbur said, accepting the utensils wrapped in a paper napkin. "Holler if you need anything else," Opal replied, topping off his coffee cup without being asked. The first bite of meatloaf was exactly what he'd hoped for. Hearty, well-seasoned, and satisfying in that particular way that only diner food could manage. It tasted like the kind of meal his grandmother might have made if she'd owned a restaurant instead of just feeding a family of 7 on a factory worker's salary. The potatoes were creamy and buttery. The green beans had just enough snap left in them to provide texture contrast. As he ate, Wilbur found himself studying the other customers more closely. The man at the counter had finished his burger and was now working on what looked like chocolate cake, while his companion had abandoned her salad half-eaten. The two truckers across the room were still talking, but their conversation had shifted to something that required more gesturing and lower voices. A family of 4 had claimed a large booth near the back, parents and 2 teenage kids who all looked exhausted and slightly cranky in the way that suggested they were in the middle of a long road trip. The diner had that particular atmosphere of places that exist primarily to serve travelers, a sense of temporary community among people who would probably never see each other again. Everyone was polite but distant, focused on their immediate needs for food and rest rather than any kind of social interaction. It was a place where you could be alone with your thoughts while still being surrounded by other human beings. which was exactly what Wilbur needed after 9 hours of staring at asphalt and listening to CB chatter. He was about halfway through his meatloaf when he noticed something odd about the taste. Not bad exactly, but different from what he'd expected. There was an underlying flavor that he couldn't quite identify, something slightly metallic, like the taste that sometimes lingered in your mouth after taking certain vitamins. He paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, considering the bite of food that sat there. Maybe it was just the seasoning. Some diners used different spice combinations than others, and he'd encountered plenty of regional variations in his travels. Down in Louisiana, everything had a kick to it. Up in Maine, they liked their food plainer, more focused on the ingredients themselves than on elaborate flavoring. This place was in Georgia, so maybe they used some kind of southern seasoning blend he wasn't familiar with. He took another bite, paying closer attention to the flavor profile. The metallic taste was definitely there, but subtle enough that he might not have noticed it if he'd been hungrier or more distracted. It wasn't unpleasant, just unusual. He glanced around the diner to see if any of the other customers seemed to be having similar experiences with their food, but everyone appeared to be eating normally. The man at the counter was scraping the last of the frosting off his cake plate with obvious satisfaction. The family in the back booth was sharing a basket of what looked like fried mozzarella sticks, the teenagers actually smiling for the first time since he'd noticed them. If there was something wrong with the food, surely someone else would have mentioned it by now. Wilbur decided he was probably just tired and overthinking things. The meatloaf was well prepared and obviously fresh. The restaurant looked clean and properly maintained, and Opal seemed like the kind of waitress who'd been doing this job long enough to know quality when she saw it. He finished the rest of his dinner without further concern, actually enjoying the way the different flavors played against each other. When Opal came by with the coffee pot again, she noticed his empty plate. "How was everything, hun?" "Excellent," Wilbur said, and he meant it. Despite the slight oddness he'd detected in the first few bites, the meal had been satisfying and well-portioned. "Exactly what I needed after a long day." She smiled, the expression transforming her tired features into something warmer and more maternal. "That's what we like to hear. You ready for that apple pie?" "Absolutely." The pie arrived a few minutes later, a generous wedge of flaky crust filled with cinnamon-spiced apples and topped with a scoop of vanilla ice cream that was already beginning to melt around the edges. The first bite was pure comfort food. Heaven. Tart fruit balanced by sweet crust, the cold ice cream providing temperature contrast against the room-temperature pie filling. If there had been any unusual flavors in the meatloaf, they were completely absent from the dessert. As he worked his way through the pie, Wilbur found himself feeling more relaxed than he had in weeks. The combination of good food, decent coffee, and the gentle hum of conversation from the other diners created an atmosphere of contentment that was increasingly rare in his life. Maybe he should make a point of stopping at places like this more often, instead of just grabbing prepackaged sandwiches from convenience stores or eating fast food in his cab while parked at rest areas. He was scraping the last of the ice cream from his plate when a man in a rumpled business suit approached his table. "Excuse me," the man said, "but I couldn't help noticing your truck out there. Beautiful Peterbilt. What year?" 2018, Wilbur replied, setting down his spoon. 389 model. She's got the big sleeper and all the options. "Mind if I sit for a minute? I'm waiting for my wife to finish in the restroom, and I've always been fascinated by the trucking industry." The man gestured toward the empty seat across from Wilbur. "Sure, go ahead." The man slid into the booth with a sigh of relief. He was probably in his mid-40s with thinning brown hair and the soft look of someone who spent most of his time behind a desk. His suit was expensive but wrinkled, suggesting he'd been traveling for a while. "I'm Elmer Patterson," he said, extending his hand across the table. "Wilbur Kowalski." They shook hands briefly. Elmer's grip was soft, lacking the calluses that came from physical work. "You mind if I ask what you're hauling? I mean, if it's not confidential or anything." "Electronics, TVs, stereo equipment, that kind of thing. Nothing too exciting." Elmer nodded with the kind of interest that suggested he was genuinely curious rather than just making small talk. "Long haul, I assume? You look like you've been on the road for a while." "Miami to Baltimore. Do it every couple weeks." Wilbur glanced out the window at his truck, checking it out of habit even though he was only 30 feet away. "What about you? What line of work are you in?" "Insurance. Corporate policies, mostly. Pretty boring compared to what you do." Elmer leaned back in his seat, studying Wilbur with an expression that seemed more intense than the conversation warranted. "Must be lonely out there, though. All those hours by yourself." "You get used to it. Actually prefer it most of the time." "Really, I don't think I could handle that much isolation. Need human contact, you know? Social interaction." Elmer's eyes were very blue, almost unnaturally bright under the diner's fluorescent lights. "How do you stay alert during those long stretches? Ever have problems with fatigue?" The question struck Wilbur as slightly odd. Not the content so much as the way Elmer asked it, with a clinical precision that didn't match his casual demeanor. "Federal regulations limit how many hours you can drive. Have to take breaks, log everything. System works pretty well. But sometimes you must get tired anyway, right? Feel like you're not thinking as clearly as usual?" Before Wilbur could answer, a woman appeared at the table. She was probably Elmer's age, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of severe expression that suggested she wasn't particularly happy about something. "The restroom here is disgusting," she announced. "Can we please just go?" "Of course, dear." Elmer stood up, but his eyes remained fixed on Wilbur. "It was nice talking with you. Drive safe out there." After they left, Wilbur sat alone with his empty pie plate and lukewarm coffee, thinking about the strange interaction. There had been something off about Elmer's questions, a probing quality that went beyond casual curiosity about the trucking industry, and why the specific focus on fatigue and mental clarity. Opal appeared with his check and a fresh cup of coffee he hadn't requested. "Those folks bother you?" she asked, nodding toward the door where Elmer and his wife had disappeared into the parking lot. "Not really, just seemed a little odd." "Get all kinds in here. Most are decent people, but sometimes..." She shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. "You feeling all right, hon? You look a little pale." Now that she mentioned it, Wilbur did feel slightly off. Not sick exactly, but not quite right either. His head felt heavy, and there was a faint buzzing sensation behind his eyes that reminded him of the early stages of a migraine. "Probably just tired. Been a long day." "Well, you get yourself some rest, and drink plenty of water. Dehydration can sneak up on you." Wilbur left a generous tip and paid his check at the register near the front door. The teenage cashier barely looked up from his phone as he processed the payment, which was fine by Wilbur. He stepped out into the parking lot, where the September air felt cooler than it had when he'd arrived. The lot was busier now, with several more trucks parked in the spaces designated for commercial vehicles. As he walked toward his Peterbilt, that strange, heavy feeling in his head intensified. His steps felt less certain than usual, and he had to concentrate more than normal to maintain his balance. Maybe Opal was right about the dehydration. He made a mental note to drink some water before he went to sleep. He was fumbling with his keys at the driver's side door when he noticed the white sedan parked about 50 feet away. Even in the artificial lighting of the parking lot, he could see two figures in the front seats, and something about their stillness suggested they were watching him. The car looked like it might be the same one that Elmer and his wife had climbed into after leaving the diner, though it was hard to be certain at this distance. Wilbur managed to get his door unlocked and climbed up into the cab. The familiar environment should have been comforting, but instead it felt somehow foreign as if he was seeing it through someone else's eyes. The buzzing sensation in his head was getting worse, accompanied now by a faint nausea that reminded him of motion sickness. He glanced in his mirrors and saw that the white sedan was still there, its occupants still motionless in the front seats. Were they waiting for something? Or someone? The smart thing would be to start the engine and drive to a different part of the lot, maybe park closer to other trucks where there would be more activity and witnesses. But when Wilbur turned the key, nothing happened. No engine turnover, no electrical response. Nothing. He tried again with the same result. That's when he realized his hands were shaking. Wilbur stared at his trembling hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what was happening to his body. The shaking had started in his fingers and was now spreading up his arms, accompanied by that increasingly intense buzzing sensation behind his eyes. It felt like someone had tuned his nervous system to a frequency just slightly off from normal reality. He tried the ignition again, pumping the accelerator pedal the way his father had taught him to do with flooded engines back when carburetors were still common. Nothing. Not even the clicking sound that usually indicated a dead battery. The dashboard remained completely dark. No warning lights, no electronic displays, as if the truck had suddenly decided to become an elaborate piece of sculpture instead of a working vehicle. In his side mirror, the white sedan remained motionless in its parking spot. He couldn't make out the faces of the occupants through the windshield, but their silhouettes hadn't moved in the 10 minutes since he'd first noticed them. Were they asleep? Waiting for something specific to happen? Or just coincidentally parked there for reasons that had nothing to do with him? The nausea was getting worse, rolling through his stomach in waves that reminded him of the food poisoning he'd gotten from a gas station burrito in New Mexico 3 years ago. But this felt different somehow. Not quite the same biological response to contaminated food, but something more systemic, like his entire body was gradually becoming disconnected from his conscious control. He fumbled for his cell phone, intending to call roadside assistance, but discovered that his fingers wouldn't cooperate properly with the touchscreen. The simple act of unlocking the phone required 3 attempts, and when he finally managed to access his contacts, the names and numbers seemed to blur together in ways that made no sense. He could read individual letters clearly, but somehow couldn't process them into coherent words. That's when he remembered Elmer's questions about fatigue and mental clarity. The insurance salesman had been oddly specific in his interest in how truckers dealt with alertness problems. And then there was that strange metallic taste in the meatloaf, barely noticeable at first, but definitely present throughout the meal. The realization hit him like ice water in his veins. Someone had drugged his food. But why? Robbery seemed like the obvious motive, but his truck was locked and his wallet contained maybe $60 in cash. His cargo was valuable, but stealing 40,000 pounds of electronics would require equipment and planning that went far beyond slipping something into a diner meal. And if they wanted to rob him, why not just wait until he was asleep in his sleeper berth like normal truck stop thieves did? The questions multiplied faster than answers, each one more disturbing than the last. How many people were involved? Was Opal part of it, or just an unwitting accomplice? What about the cook, the cashier, the manager who presumably oversaw the entire operation? Was this something that happened regularly, or was he just unlucky enough to be selected for some reason he couldn't understand? His vision was starting to blur now, objects doubling and tripling at the edges of his peripheral vision. The parking lot lights had developed halos that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, and the normal sounds of the truck stop, idling engines, closing doors, muffled conversations, seemed to be coming from underwater. Whatever they had given him was working faster now, overwhelming his system with a pharmaceutical efficiency that suggested professional knowledge rather than amateur experimentation. He needed help, but calling 911 was becoming increasingly difficult as his motor skills deteriorated. The phone felt impossibly heavy in his hands, and the numbers on the screen kept rearranging themselves when he tried to focus on them. Even if he managed to place the call, would he be able to communicate coherently enough to explain his situation? A tap on his passenger side window made him jump, his heart rate spiking as adrenaline momentarily cleared some of the chemical fog from his brain. Elmer stood beside the truck, no longer wearing the wrinkled business suit, but dressed in dark clothing that made him nearly invisible against the night sky. His wife was nowhere to be seen, but she'd probably never existed anyway. Just part of whatever elaborate performance they'd staged in the diner. "Having trouble with your truck?" Elmer asked, his voice muffled by the glass, but still carrying that same false concern he'd demonstrated earlier. "I know a little about engines. Maybe I could take a look?" Wilbur shook his head, not trusting his voice to work properly. Even that simple motion made the world spin around him like a carnival ride, and he had to grip the steering wheel tighter to keep from falling sideways in his seat. "Come on now," Elmer continued, trying the door handle. "No need to be antisocial. We're just trying to help a fellow traveler in distress." The door was locked, but Wilbur realized that wouldn't matter much if he lost consciousness completely. These people, however many of them there were, had clearly done this before. They'd perfected their technique through practice, refining their approach until they could disable a target without creating a scene that might attract unwanted attention from other truck stop customers. He forced himself to focus on his phone again, managing to open his recent calls list. The top number was his dispatcher in Miami, a woman named Rosa, who handled logistics for his small freight company. If he could just manage to call her, maybe she'd realize something was wrong when he couldn't speak coherently and contact emergency services on his behalf. But before he could complete the call, his phone screen went dark. Not powered off, just black, as if someone had cut the signal remotely. He pressed the power button repeatedly, but nothing happened. The device had become as useless as his truck's ignition system. "Technology can be so unreliable," Elmer observed, apparently having watched the entire process through the window. "Especially when you really need it to work. That's why it's always best to rely on the kindness of strangers." The white sedan had moved closer now, parking directly in front of his truck in a position that would block any attempt to push-start the vehicle or allow it to be towed without first moving the car. A second vehicle, a dark pickup truck that he hadn't noticed before, had positioned itself behind his trailer, completing the box formation that trapped his Peterbilt in place. Wilbur's training kicked in despite his deteriorating condition. In trucking school, they'd taught basic defensive strategies for dealing with hijackers and thieves. Stay in the cab if possible, keep the doors locked, use the CB radio to call for help, and never voluntarily surrender control of your vehicle. But those strategies assumed you'd remain conscious and capable of operating your equipment, neither of which seemed likely given his current trajectory. The CB radio was his last hope. Unlike his cell phone, it operated on different frequencies and would be harder to jam remotely. If he could reach the microphone and key up on channel 19, the frequency monitored by most truckers, maybe someone would hear him and send help. He stretched toward the radio mount on his dashboard, but his depth perception had deteriorated to the point where he misjudged the distance completely, his hand passing through empty air several inches from his target. The second attempt was more successful, his fingers finally making contact with the microphone cord, but when he tried to lift it from its holder, his grip failed and it clattered to the floor of the cab. "Having difficulty?" Elmer asked, and now there was open amusement in his voice. "That's perfectly normal. The medication we use is designed to interfere with motor coordination while leaving cognitive function mostly intact. We find that patients respond better to suggestions when they can still understand what's happening to them." Patience. The word sent a chill through Wilbur's drug-addled consciousness that was far colder than the September night air. Whatever these people were doing, it wasn't simple robbery. They were talking about him like he was a medical subject, something to be studied rather than just robbed and abandoned. The passenger door handle rattled as someone tried to open it from outside. When that failed, he heard the distinctive sound of metal against metal. Someone was working on the lock with tools, probably the same kind of Slim Jim devices that repo men use to gain entry to vehicles without causing obvious damage. He tried to slide across the seat toward the driver's side door, thinking maybe he could escape that way, but his body wasn't responding to his mental commands anymore. His legs felt disconnected from his torso, and his arms had become heavy and unresponsive. The best he could manage was a slight shift in position that accomplished nothing except to make him more aware of how completely helpless he was becoming. The lock mechanism gave way with a soft click, and the passenger door swung open to reveal Elmer and two other men Wilbur hadn't seen before. One was tall and thin with prematurely gray hair, wearing what looked like medical scrubs under a lightweight jacket. The other was shorter and stockier, with the kind of utilitarian clothing and confident manner that suggested military or law enforcement background. "There we go," Elmer said, climbing up into the cab with the easy familiarity of someone who'd done this many times before. "Much better than trying to communicate through glass, don't you think?" The man in scrubs followed, carrying a small black bag that looked suspiciously like a medical kit. He immediately began checking Wilbur's pulse and examining his pupils with a small pen light, making notes in a pocket notebook with the clinical detachment of a doctor conducting a routine physical exam. "Vitals are good," he reported to Elmer. "Reflexes appropriately diminished, but cardiovascular system is stable. Should be optimal for transport in another 10 to 15 minutes. Transport. The word hit Wilbur like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about their intentions. These weren't thieves or carjackers operating on impulse or opportunity. They were part of something organized, something that required medical knowledge and careful planning, something that involved moving unconscious people from one location to another for purposes he didn't want to imagine. "Where?" he managed to croak, the single word requiring enormous effort to produce. "Where are we taking you?" Elmer asked, settling into the passenger seat as if he owned the truck. "That depends on several factors. Your blood type, general health, psychological profile, that sort of thing. Don't worry, though. We'll take excellent care of you during the evaluation process." Evaluation process. Blood type. The implications were becoming clearer and more terrifying by the minute. These people weren't just kidnapping random truckers for ransom or forced labor. They were selecting specific individuals based on medical criteria, which suggested they were supplying someone or something that required fresh human biological material. The man in scrubs prepared a syringe from a small vial in his medical kit. "This will help you relax," he explained in the same calm, professional tone a legitimate doctor might use before administering anesthesia. "You'll feel much more comfortable in just a few minutes." Wilbur tried to pull away from the needle, but his body had progressed beyond his ability to control it. The injection site barely registered as a pinprick, and within seconds he could feel a new chemical warmth spreading through his bloodstream, different from whatever had been in his food but somehow complementary to it. "The beauty of our system," Elmer explained, apparently feeling chatty now that his victim was fully secured, "is that it looks completely natural from the outside. Trucker stops at a diner, eats a meal, feels tired afterward, and decides to take a nap in his cab. Happens thousands of times every night across the country. Who's going to question that?" The third man had remained outside, but now he appeared at the open door with a set of keys that definitely weren't Wilbur's. "Got it running," he announced. "Electronics were just disconnected, not damaged. Should drive normally." "Excellent. Take us to the secondary location and we'll transfer him there. Make sure you stay within posted speed limits. We don't need any unwanted attention from law enforcement." As the man climbed into the driver's seat and started Wilbur's engine with casual efficiency, the full scope of their operation became clear. They had the knowledge to disable his truck's electrical system, the medical expertise to administer precise dosages of incapacitating drugs, and the organizational capability to coordinate multiple people and vehicles in a complex kidnapping operation. This wasn't amateur hour. It was a professional enterprise that probably victimized truckers on a regular basis. The last thing Wilbur remembered as consciousness finally slipped away was the sound of his own CB radio crackling to life. Some distant trucker was broadcasting a warning about unusual activity at truck stops along I-95, advising other drivers to be extra cautious about accepting food or assistance from strangers. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't come about 12 hours too late to do him any good. As his Peterbilt pulled out of the truck stop parking lot with strangers at the wheel, Wilbur wondered how many other drivers had received similar warnings and how many had heeded them in time to avoid ending up in the same situation he now faced. He wondered if anyone would miss him before it was too late, and whether the electronics shipment in his trailer would ever reach its intended destination in Baltimore. Most of all, he wondered what exactly they planned to evaluate him for, and whether he would survive the process long enough to find out. Wilbur drifted back to consciousness slowly, like surfacing from deep, dark water. The first thing he noticed was the cold, not just the ambient temperature of whatever room he was in, but the specific chill of metal against his bare skin. He was lying on some kind of steel table, and when he tried to move, he discovered that thick leather straps secured his wrists, ankles, and torso to the surface. The room around him was sterile and white, with the kind of harsh fluorescent lighting he associated with hospitals or laboratories. Medical equipment hummed and beeped at the periphery of his vision, machines he couldn't identify but which gave off the unmistakable electronic presence of complex diagnostic tools. The air smelled of disinfectant and something else, something organic and unpleasant that he couldn't quite place. "Good, you're awake," said a familiar voice. Elmer stepped into his field of vision, now dressed in surgical scrubs and latex gloves. The friendly insurance salesman persona had been completely abandoned, replaced by something clinical and predatory. "We were beginning to worry that we'd miscalculated the dosage. First-time subjects can be unpredictable." Wilbur tried to speak, but discovered that his throat felt raw and swollen, as if something had been inserted and then removed while he was unconscious. When he finally managed to produce sound, it came out as a hoarse whisper. What do you want?" "Want?" Elmer seemed genuinely amused by the question. "This isn't about what we want. It's about what our clients need, and what you're uniquely positioned to provide." He consulted a clipboard hanging from the end of the table. "Wilbur Kowalski, age 53, blood type AB negative. Excellent cardiovascular health according to your last DOT physical. No significant medical history, no known allergies, minimal alcohol consumption, non-smoker for the past 8 years. The level of detail was terrifying. They'd somehow accessed his complete medical records, his DOT certification files, probably his entire personal history. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. They'd been studying him, possibly for weeks or months, waiting for the right moment to put their plan into action. "How did you—" Wilbur began, but Elmer cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Information is surprisingly easy to obtain when you know where to look. DMV records, insurance databases, medical billing systems, they're all connected now, and most have woefully inadequate security protocols." He made another note on his clipboard. "Your trucking company uses a third-party service for driver health monitoring. Did you know they store everything in cloud servers with password protection that a first-year computer science student could bypass?" The man in scrubs, apparently a real doctor, or at least someone with extensive medical training, appeared beside the table with a tray of instruments that looked like they belonged in an operating room. Scalpels, forceps, various electronic devices that Wilbur couldn't identify, but which radiated the same clinical menace as everything else in this sterile nightmare. "We should begin the preliminary assessment," the doctor said to Elmer. "The client is expecting delivery within 48 hours, and we need time for proper preparation." "Delivery," The word sent ice through Wilbur's veins. Whatever they were planning, it involved moving him somewhere else, to someone who had specific requirements and a definite timeline. This wasn't about holding him for ransom or using him for manual labor. It was about providing him to a third party who had ordered him like a piece of equipment. "What client?" Wilbur managed to ask. "What are you talking about?" The doctor began connecting sensors to various parts of his body, electrodes on his chest and temples, a pulse oximeter on his finger, a blood pressure cuff around his upper arm. Each device fed information to the humming machines that surrounded the table, building what appeared to be a comprehensive physiological profile. "There are people in this world," Elmer explained, settling into a chair beside the table like he was preparing for a lengthy conversation, "who have very specific medical needs that can't be met through conventional healthcare systems. They require biological materials that must be fresh, uncontaminated, and matched to precise criteria. That's where we come in." Biological materials. Wilbur's mind recoiled from the implications, but there was no escaping the obvious conclusion. They were harvesting organs, or blood, or both, and selling them to wealthy clients who couldn't or wouldn't wait for legitimate transplant procedures. The mobile laboratory, the detailed medical screening, the emphasis on his excellent health, it all pointed to the same horrifying reality. "You're insane," he whispered. "Are we?" The doctor looked up from his instruments with the mild expression of someone discussing the weather. "Consider the mathematics. There are currently over 100,000 Americans on organ waiting lists. Many will die before suitable donors become available. Meanwhile, there are millions of healthy individuals who could provide exactly what these patients need, but who will never voluntarily participate in the donor system. We've simply identified a market inefficiency and developed a solution," Elmer added. "Supply and demand, basic economics. The fact that current laws don't recognize the legitimacy of our business model doesn't make it inherently wrong." They were talking about murder and organ theft like it was a rational business decision, complete with economic justifications and market analysis. The casual way they discussed dismantling human beings for spare parts was somehow more terrifying than any amount of anger or obvious psychosis would have been. The monitoring equipment was painting a complete picture of his physical condition now. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen levels, brain activity, kidney function, liver enzymes. Every system in his body was being evaluated like components in a machine scheduled for disassembly. "The fascinating thing about truckers," the doctor continued, apparently warming to his subject, "is that they're often in excellent health despite their lifestyle challenges. All that sitting might seem like it would create cardiovascular problems, but federal regulations require regular medical certification. Drivers who develop serious health issues lose their commercial licenses, so there's a natural selection process that weeds out the unhealthy specimens. Plus," Elmer added, "truckers tend to be socially isolated. They can disappear for days or weeks without anyone noticing, which gives us operational flexibility that wouldn't be possible with other population segments." Wilbur thought about his ex-wives, his distant children, his landlord who probably wouldn't miss him until next month's rent was due. Rosa at the dispatch office might wonder where he was when he missed his delivery window, but even she would probably assume he'd broken down somewhere or decided to quit without notice. How many other drivers had simply vanished from the highways without anyone raising serious questions about their whereabouts? A new person entered the room. A woman in her 30s with short auburn hair and the kind of professional demeanor that suggested management rather than hands-on medical work. She carried a tablet computer and wore an expensive business suit that looked out of place in the clinical environment. "Status report," she said to Elmer without preamble. "Initial assessment is nearly complete. All indicators suggest optimal viability for the primary client. We should be ready for extraction within 6 hours. Extraction. The euphemism was almost worse than direct language would have been. They were going to cut him apart while he was still alive, methodically removing whatever organs their client had purchased, and they were discussing it like a routine surgical procedure. "What about secondary markets?" the woman asked, consulting her tablet. "Any viable components for the standing orders?" "Almost certainly. Type AB negative blood alone will cover our operational costs, and preliminary scans suggest excellent kidney and liver function. We should be able to fill at least 3 additional requests from this single subject." They were planning to use every part of him, like a slaughterhouse processing livestock. Nothing would be wasted. Everything would find a buyer somewhere in their network of clients who could afford to purchase human biological materials without asking uncomfortable questions about their sources. The woman nodded and made notes on her tablet. "Estimated revenue?" "Conservative estimate, 400,000. Possibly more if the cardiac assessment confirms what the preliminary data suggests." $400,000. That's what his life was worth to them, not as a person with thoughts and feelings and people who cared about him, but as a collection of useful biological components that could be monetized through careful market analysis. "The client is expecting delivery tomorrow evening," the woman continued. "Transportation is arranged and the surgical team will be standing by. Any potential complications?" The doctor checked his instruments one final time. "None anticipated. Subject is in excellent health and should tolerate the procedures well. We'll maintain consciousness through the initial phases to ensure optimal organ viability." They were going to keep him awake while they dissected him. The drugs they'd used to capture him were apparently designed to paralyze rather than provide unconsciousness, ensuring that his organs would remain fresh and undamaged by anesthetics that might compromise their value to buyers. Wilbur closed his eyes and tried to think of anything else. His first truck, his mother's cooking, the sunrise he'd watched over the Chesapeake Bay last spring. But the clinical conversation continued around him, a detailed discussion of surgical techniques and market prices that made it impossible to escape the reality of his situation. "We should begin preparation," the woman announced. "I have calls to make, and the client doesn't tolerate delays." As they left the room to gather additional equipment, Wilbur found himself alone with the humming machines and the smell of disinfectant. He tested the restraints again, knowing it was hopeless but unable to stop trying. The leather straps were thick and professionally applied, designed to hold someone much stronger than him. Through a small window high on the wall, he could see a slice of sky that was beginning to lighten with dawn. Somewhere out there, other truckers were starting their routes, checking their loads, planning their stops for the day. His Peterbilt was probably in some warehouse or chop shop, being stripped for parts or prepared for sale with forged registration documents. Rosa would notice eventually that he'd missed his delivery. She might even call the police, though they'd probably assume he'd simply decided to quit his job without notice, something that happened more often than most people realized in the trucking industry. By the time anyone started asking serious questions about his whereabouts, there would be nothing left to find. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway outside made him open his eyes. They were coming back, probably with the surgical instruments and whatever drugs they used to keep victims conscious during the extraction process. In a few hours, Wilbur Kowalski would cease to exist, transformed into a collection of valuable biological materials destined for clients who could afford to purchase life itself. He wondered if Opal had known what was in that meatloaf, or if she'd been just another unwitting participant in their system. He wondered how many other truck stops along I-95 were equipped to identify and drug potential victims. Most of all, he wondered if anyone would ever figure out what had happened to him and whether they'd be able to stop it from happening to other drivers who just wanted to grab a decent meal at the end of a long day on the road. The surgical team returned 3 hours later, wheeling in additional equipment that transformed the sterile room into something resembling an operating theater. Bright lights on adjustable arms, monitoring devices with screens that would track his vital signs throughout whatever they planned to do to him, and a cart filled with instruments that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent illumination. Wilbur had spent those 3 hours testing every possible means of escape, straining against the leather restraints until his wrists bled, trying to work his way free through micro-movements that accomplished nothing except to confirm how thoroughly they'd secured him to the table. The drugs in his system had metabolized enough that his thinking was clear, but his body remained weak and uncoordinated, betraying him when he needed physical strength most. The woman in the business suit, apparently the operations manager, had returned with a different tablet and an air of barely contained urgency that suggested their timeline had accelerated. She positioned herself near the door like she was prepared to leave quickly if something went wrong, while Elmer and the doctor began their final preparations. "The client has moved up their schedule," she announced. "They want delivery in 18 hours instead of 24. Can we accommodate?" The doctor consulted his instruments and made some calculations on a notepad. "It's aggressive, but manageable. We'll need to skip some of the standard preparation protocols, but the core procedures should remain viable." "Do it. This client pays premium rates and doesn't accept excuses." They were talking about him like a product on an assembly line, something to be processed according to quality specifications and delivery schedules. The casual dehumanization was complete. He'd become a collection of valuable components to be harvested as efficiently as possible for maximum profit. A new person joined the team, a younger man wearing scrubs who wheeled in what appeared to be a portable surgical unit, complete with its own power supply and waste disposal system. Everything they needed to perform complex medical procedures could apparently be transported and set up wherever they chose to operate, making them independent of traditional hospital facilities that might ask uncomfortable questions about their patients. "Are we maintaining consciousness for the full procedure?" the younger man asked, checking connections between various pieces of equipment. "Initial phases only," the doctor replied. "Client specifications require verification of neurological function before we proceed with the primary extraction. After that, we can provide standard anesthetic protocols." They were going to test his brain function while he was awake and alert, probably to ensure that his organs came from someone who met their client's psychological as well as physical requirements. The level of sophistication was staggering. Not just medical expertise, but detailed knowledge of how to evaluate and process human beings according to criteria that went far beyond simple biological compatibility. The woman with the tablet stepped closer to the table, studying Wilbur with the detached interest of someone examining livestock. "Has he been informed of the process?" "Basic outline only. We find that excessive detail tends to produce stress responses that can compromise organ viability." "Good. Stress hormones can alter tissue chemistry in ways that reduce market value." She made a note on her tablet. "Proceed with the standard evaluation sequence." The doctor attached additional sensors to Wilbur's head, chest, and abdomen while explaining the process in the same calm, professional tone he might use to describe a routine physical exam. "We'll begin with neurological assessment to confirm cognitive function, then proceed through cardiovascular, renal, and hepatic evaluations. Each stage will provide data our client needs to ensure they're receiving exactly what they've purchased." The first test involved flashing lights and electronic tones that measured his brain's electrical activity. They asked him questions, his name, where he was born, basic arithmetic problems, while machines recorded his responses and presumably analyzed them for signs of neurological damage or abnormality. "Excellent cognitive baseline," the doctor reported. "No indication of degenerative conditions or substance abuse effects. The client should be very satisfied with the neurological profile." They moved on to his cardiovascular system, injecting something that made his heart race while they monitored the response on multiple screens. The sensation was terrifying. His chest felt like it might explode while numbers and waveforms danced across the electronic displays that surrounded him. "Outstanding cardiac function," the younger technician observed. Ejection fraction well above normal parameters. No arrhythmias. Excellent response to stress testing. This is premium material. Premium material. That's what 17 years of careful diet and regular DOT physicals had made him, not a person with a life and relationships and dreams, but premium biological material worthy of their most expensive clients. The renal evaluation involved more injections and sensors, measuring how efficiently his kidneys filtered the various chemicals they introduced into his bloodstream. They discussed his kidney function like wine experts evaluating a vintage, noting subtle aspects of performance that would affect the organ's value in whatever market they served. Both units are functioning at optimal levels, the doctor concluded. No signs of damage from his trucking lifestyle, which is somewhat unusual. Most drivers show at least minor kidney stress from irregular hydration patterns. That's why we screened his medical records so carefully, Elmer added. This particular subject has been exceptionally conscientious about his health maintenance. It's rare to find someone his age with such pristine organ function. As they continued their evaluation, Wilbur began to understand the full scope of their operation. This wasn't a random crime committed by desperate amateurs. It was a sophisticated business that had perfected every aspect of human trafficking for organ harvesting. They had medical expertise, technological resources, administrative systems, and apparently a network of clients wealthy enough to pay premium prices for exactly what they needed. The woman with the tablet received a call on her phone and stepped away to take it privately. When she returned, her expression had hardened into something that suggested complications beyond their normal operational parameters. "We have a problem," she announced. "Local law enforcement has been asking questions about missing truckers. 3 different departments have reported drivers who failed to complete their routes along this section of I-95. They're coordinating a joint investigation." The implications hit the room like a physical force. If police were actively investigating missing drivers, their operation was compromised regardless of how careful they'd been about covering their tracks. Modern law enforcement had resources and analytical capabilities that could eventually connect the dots between seemingly unrelated disappearances. "How much time do we have?" Elmer asked. "Unknown. Could be days, could be hours. The investigation is still in early stages, but they're monitoring truck stop activities and checking on drivers who seem to be running behind schedule." The doctor began working faster, his movements becoming less methodical and more urgent. "We should proceed directly to extraction, skip the remaining diagnostic phases, and move to harvesting immediately." "Agreed. Set up for multiple organ removal and prepare for immediate transport. We'll complete the procedures en route if necessary." They were going to cut him apart in the back of a moving vehicle, rushing to complete their work before law enforcement could interfere with their business model. The casual way they adapted to this new timeline suggested they'd dealt with similar complications before, probably multiple times. As they prepared their surgical instruments, Wilbur found himself thinking about all the other truckers who'd disappeared along this stretch of highway. How many had endured exactly what he was experiencing now? How many had died in this sterile room or others like it, their lives reduced to market prices and profit margins? The younger technician began setting up what appeared to be a mobile operating table, complete with restraints and monitoring equipment that could function independently of the fixed installation where Wilbur currently lay. They were preparing to move him to a vehicle equipped for surgery, probably an RV or converted ambulance that would allow them to complete their work while traveling to wherever their client waited. "Transportation is standing by," the woman reported. "Estimated travel time to delivery point is 6 hours. That should be sufficient for all required procedures." 6 hours. That's how long it would take them to systematically remove every organ their client had purchased, probably while he remained conscious enough to understand what was happening to his body. They'd refined their techniques to maximize both organ viability and operational efficiency, turning human dismantlement into a routine medical procedure. The doctor prepared a new syringe, this one containing a clear fluid that caught the light differently than the previous chemicals. This will maintain consciousness while preventing voluntary muscle movement, he explained. You'll remain aware throughout the initial procedures, but you won't be able to resist or interfere with our work. As the needle entered his arm, Wilbur felt a familiar chemical warmth spreading through his bloodstream, but this time it was accompanied by a gradual loss of muscle control that left his mind sharp while his body became completely unresponsive. He could see everything, hear every word, understand exactly what they were planning, but he couldn't move so much as a finger to defend himself. They transferred him to the mobile table with the practiced efficiency of people who'd performed this task many times. The new restraints were unnecessary. The paralytic drug had eliminated any possibility of physical resistance, but they secured him anyway, probably out of habit rather than actual concern about escape attempts. The room began moving around him as they wheeled the table toward what must be a loading dock or vehicle bay. Through a doorway, he could see the back of what looked like a modified ambulance, its interior lined with medical equipment and monitoring devices that would support whatever procedures they planned to perform during transport. "Subject is ready for transfer," the doctor announced. "All systems are functioning normally, and we should be able to complete the full extraction sequence within the available time frame." As they loaded him into the vehicle, Wilbur caught a glimpse of the facility they were leaving, a warehouse or abandoned medical building that had been converted into their processing center. Other vehicles were parked nearby, including what might be his own Peterbilt, though he couldn't be sure from his limited viewing angle. The ambulance pulled away from the building with the smooth acceleration of a vehicle designed for emergency transport. Through a small window, he could see they were traveling on what looked like rural roads, probably heading toward their client's location through back routes that would minimize their exposure to law enforcement attention. The surgical team continued their preparations as they traveled, setting up instruments and monitoring equipment with the kind of routine competence that suggested they'd performed operations in moving vehicles before. Everything was secured against the motion of travel, designed to function normally regardless of road conditions or driving patterns. ETA to delivery point is now 5 hours and 43 minutes, the woman announced, consulting her tablet. Client has confirmed readiness to receive, and payment has been transferred to the escrow account. Payment transferred. Somewhere, someone had just paid $400,000 for Wilbur's organs, completing a transaction that would end his life and provide biological materials to people who could afford to purchase them without asking questions about their source. As the ambulance continued through the darkness toward whatever destination awaited, Wilbur found himself wondering if the police investigation would eventually uncover this operation, and whether they'd be able to save future victims, even if they couldn't help him. He wondered if anyone would ever know what had happened to him, or if he'd simply join the list of truckers who'd vanished from America's highways without explanation. The last coherent thought he managed before they began the surgical procedures was a hope that Opal had been innocent, that she'd served that meatloaf without knowing what it contained. He didn't want her to carry the weight of what was about to happen to him, even though he'd never know whether his hope was justified or simply the final kindness his mind offered itself before the end. Clifford Morrison had never been allergic to anything in his 46 years of life. Not peanuts, not shellfish, not the cocktail of chemicals and pollen that drifted across Interstate 81 during his regular runs through the Shenandoah Valley. He'd eaten truck stop food from Maine to Florida, breathed diesel fumes and industrial pollutants from dozens of manufacturing cities, and never had so much as a case of hay fever to show for it. That's what made what happened on that foggy November morning in 2020 so completely impossible to predict or prevent. Clifford was hauling automotive parts from a factory in Spartanburg, South Carolina, up to a distribution center in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was his regular route, one he'd been running twice a month for the past 4 years since he started driving for Consolidated Freight Solutions. The pay was decent, the loading and unloading were handled by dock workers at both ends, and the drive through Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains was probably the most scenic stretch of highway he'd ever been paid to traverse. His Freightliner Cascadia had 280,000 miles on the odometer, but still ran smooth as silk when he kept up with the maintenance. The sleeper cabin was spacious enough for his 6'2" frame, equipped with a small refrigerator, microwave, and the kind of firm mattress that had saved his back from the chronic pain that plagued older drivers who'd spent decades in trucks with inferior suspension systems. The weather forecast had called for fog in the valleys, but nothing that would significantly impact travel conditions. Clifford had started his day at 4 a.m. in a truck stop outside Charlotte, grabbing coffee and a breakfast sandwich before hitting the road in darkness that was just beginning to show hints of gray at the eastern horizon. The first few hours had been routine: light traffic, good road conditions, his CB radio crackling occasionally with weather updates and speed trap warnings from other drivers. The fog had rolled in around 7 a.m., just as he was climbing into the mountains north of Asheville. What started as wispy tendrils clinging to the valleys quickly thickened into a gray blanket that reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet in the worst sections. Clifford had slowed to 45 miles per hour and turned on his hazard lights, joining a slow-moving convoy of trucks and cars creeping through the mountain passes like a funeral procession. By 9 a.m., the fog had lifted enough to allow normal highway speeds, and Clifford was making good time through the rolling hills of central Virginia. His delivery wasn't scheduled until Thursday morning, giving him plenty of buffer time to deal with weather delays or mechanical problems. The load was secure, the truck was running perfectly, and he was actually enjoying the drive despite the challenging conditions earlier. That's when he decided to stop at the rest area near Staunton. It was one of those standard highway rest stops, a cluster of vending machines, picnic tables, and restroom facilities set in a grove of trees that provided shade during summer months, but looked stark and skeletal against the November sky. A few other trucks were parked in the commercial vehicle area, their drivers presumably catching up on federally mandated rest periods or dealing with logbook requirements. Clifford wasn't particularly tired, but he'd been nursing the same cup of coffee since Charlotte, and nature was making increasingly urgent demands on his attention. He pulled his Freightliner into an angled parking space, set the air brakes, and climbed down from the cab into air that smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke from someone's chimney in the distance. The restroom facilities were clean and reasonably well maintained, which wasn't always a given at highway rest stops. As he washed his hands, Clifford caught his reflection in the mirror above the sink. A weathered face with gray creeping into his brown beard, laugh lines around his eyes that had deepened over 4 years of squinting through windshields, and the kind of solid build that came from loading his own freight before he'd found a company that handled that for him. He looked healthy, which he was. His last DOT physical had been 6 months ago, and he'd passed every test with flying colors. Blood pressure normal, vision 20/20, no signs of diabetes or heart disease or any of the other conditions that could cost a driver his commercial license. The examining doctor had actually commented on his excellent health for someone his age, attributing it to the fact that Clifford had never smoked and rarely drank alcohol. On his way back to the truck, he passed the vending machine area and decided to grab a snack for the road. The selection was typical: chips, candy bars, crackers, various combinations of salt and sugar designed to provide quick energy and satisfy cravings. He chose a package of trail mix, thinking the nuts and dried fruit would be a healthier option than pure junk food. The trail mix came in a clear plastic package that allowed him to see the contents: peanuts, cashews, almonds, raisins, and what looked like small pieces of dried papaya or mango. Nothing he hadn't eaten hundreds of times before. The expiration date was still 6 months away, the package was properly sealed, and the brand was one he recognized from grocery stores. He paid the $2.50 with quarters from his cup holder, tore open the package as he walked back to his truck, and popped a handful of the mixture into his mouth while climbing up into the cab. The taste was exactly what he expected. Salty nuts balanced by sweet fruit, with the slight tropical flavor of the dried papaya providing an interesting contrast. Clifford pulled out of the rest area and back onto I-81 North, munching the trail mix and listening to a talk radio show that was discussing supply chain disruptions and their impact on the trucking industry. The fog had completely cleared now, revealing the kind of crisp autumn day that made him grateful to have a job that kept him outdoors instead of trapped in some office cubicle. He was about 20 miles north of Staunton when the first symptoms appeared. It started as a slight itching sensation on his arms, barely noticeable at first, but gradually becoming more persistent. He scratched absent-mindedly while maintaining his focus on the road, assuming it was just dry skin or maybe a reaction to the new laundry detergent his ex-wife had recommended during their last awkward phone conversation about their daughter's college expenses. The itching spread to his chest and back over the next few miles, becoming intense enough that he found himself squirming in his seat and trying to scratch through his flannel shirt without taking his hands off the steering wheel for more than a few seconds at a time. The sensation was unlike anything he'd experienced before, not the surface irritation of a mosquito bite or poison ivy, but something deeper, like his skin was trying to crawl away from his body. By the time he reached the Lexington exit, the itching had been joined by a burning sensation in his throat that made swallowing difficult. At first, he thought he might be coming down with a cold or flu. Truckers were constantly exposed to germs from truck stops, loading docks, and restaurants where hundreds of people passed through every day. But this didn't feel like the gradual onset of illness he was familiar with. It was too sudden, too intense, and getting worse by the minute. He pulled off at the next exit, looking for a place to park where he could figure out what was happening to his body. The small town beyond the off-ramp consisted mainly of a gas station, a McDonald's, and a few local businesses that looked like they'd been there since the 1950s. He chose the gas station, reasoning that if he needed medical attention, someone there could probably give him directions to the nearest hospital. As he maneuvered his truck into the diesel bay, Clifford caught sight of himself in the side mirror and felt his chest tighten with alarm. His face was covered with red welts that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier, and his neck looked swollen enough that his shirt collar was uncomfortably tight. Whatever was happening to him was accelerating, transforming from minor irritation to what was obviously a serious medical emergency. He tried to climb down from the cab, but his legs were weak and unsteady in a way that reminded him of the one time he'd gotten food poisoning from a questionable truck stop burrito. Except this was different. Not the digestive distress of contaminated food, but something systemic that was affecting his entire body simultaneously. The young man working at the gas station noticed his condition immediately. "Jesus, mister, you okay? You look like you got stung by a whole nest of wasps." Clifford tried to respond, but discovered that his throat had swollen enough to make speech difficult. The words came out as a raspy whisper that barely carried the 10 feet between him and the gas station attendant. "Can't breathe right," he managed to croak. "Need help." The attendant, whose name tag identified him as Luther, was probably 19 or 20 years old, with the kind of wide-eyed expression that suggested he'd never dealt with a medical emergency before. But he had the presence of mind to prop open the station's front door and call out to someone inside. "Hey, Mrs. Patterson, call 911. This truck driver's having some kind of allergic reaction or something." Allergic reaction. The words hit Clifford like a physical blow, even though part of his mind had already reached the same conclusion. He'd eaten something in that trail mix that his body had decided to reject with overwhelming force, and the reaction was escalating beyond anything he could have imagined possible. He'd heard about severe allergies, of course. Everyone knew about people who carried EpiPens and had to avoid certain foods, or risk dying from anaphylactic shock. But he'd always assumed that was something you discovered in childhood, not something that could suddenly appear in middle age without any warning signs or previous episodes. Luther helped him to a plastic chair outside the gas station's front door, talking in a reassuring voice that suggested he was trying to keep both of them calm while they waited for emergency medical services to arrive. "Ambulance is on the way," he said. "Maybe 15 minutes. You just try to stay calm and keep breathing, okay?" Breathing was becoming the central challenge. Each inhalation required conscious effort, and the burning sensation in his throat was spreading to his lungs in a way that made him feel like he was drowning from the inside out. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now, and the red welts on his face and arms were spreading and connecting into larger patches of inflamed skin. "What did you eat?" Luther asked, apparently having some knowledge of how allergic reactions worked. Might be important for the paramedics to know. "Trail mix," Clifford wheezed. "From vending machine at rest stop." What kind of nuts? Peanuts? Tree nuts? The distinction had never mattered to him before, but now it seemed critically important. "All kinds," he gasped. "Peanuts, cashews, almonds, some dried fruit." Luther nodded and relayed this information to whoever he was talking to on his cell phone, probably the 911 dispatcher trying to provide the incoming ambulance crew with preliminary information about what they'd be dealing with. The waiting was agony. Every minute that passed brought new symptoms or worsening of existing ones. His vision was starting to blur around the edges, and there was a strange metallic taste in his mouth that reminded him of the time he'd accidentally bitten down on a piece of aluminum foil. His heart was racing at a pace that made him wonder if cardiac arrest was a possible consequence of whatever was happening to his immune system. "How long you been driving trucks?" Luther asked, apparently trying to keep him distracted while they waited for professional help. 4 years, Clifford managed, though speaking was becoming increasingly difficult as his throat continued to swell. "You ever have anything like this happen before?" He shook his head, conserving his energy for breathing rather than trying to explain that he'd never been allergic to anything in his entire life, that this was as much a surprise to him as it was to everyone else witnessing it. The sound of sirens in the distance was the most beautiful thing he'd heard in years. Help was coming. People with medical training and equipment who might be able to reverse whatever was happening to his body before it progressed beyond the point of no return. But as the ambulance turned into the gas station parking lot, Clifford realized that his breathing was becoming so labored that he might not have enough time left for even the most skilled paramedics to save him. Each breath required enormous effort, and the spaces between breaths were getting longer as his throat continued to close off his airway. The ambulance screeched to a halt just feet from where he sat, and 2 paramedics jumped out with the kind of practiced urgency that suggested they'd dealt with severe allergic reactions before. The first was a woman in her 30s with short blonde hair and the confident demeanor of someone who'd seen every kind of medical emergency the highway could produce. Her name tag read Velma, and she was already reaching for equipment before she'd even reached his chair. "Severe allergic reaction," Luther called out, apparently having appointed himself as the information coordinator. "He ate trail mix maybe 30 minutes ago. Says he's never been allergic to anything before." Velma was checking Clifford's pulse and examining his swollen face and neck with professional efficiency. "Blood pressure's dropping," she called to her partner, a younger man who was setting up what looked like a portable IV system. "Respiratory distress is severe. We need to intubate now or we're going to lose him." The words sent ice through Clifford's chest. Lose him. They were talking about his death as a real possibility, something that might happen in the next few minutes if they couldn't get his breathing under control. The abstract fear he'd been feeling suddenly became concrete and immediate. "Sir, I'm going to give you something to help with the breathing," Velma explained, preparing a syringe that looked larger than anything he'd ever seen in a doctor's office. "This is epinephrine. It should counteract the allergic reaction and open up your airways." The injection went into his thigh with a sharp pain that was almost welcome compared to the suffocating sensation that had been building in his chest, Within seconds, he could feel his heart rate spike even higher, but more importantly, he could also feel his throat beginning to open slightly, allowing precious air to reach his lungs. "That's helping," he managed to whisper, the first words he'd been able to speak clearly in over 10 minutes. "Good, but we're not out of the woods yet," Velma replied, already preparing additional medications. "Severe reactions like this can bounce back even after initial treatment. We need to get you to a hospital where they can monitor you and provide sustained therapy." Her partner had the IV established now, and Clifford could see bags of clear fluid that were apparently designed to keep his blood pressure stable while his body fought off whatever had triggered this massive immune response. The efficiency of their operation was impressive. Within 5 minutes of arriving, they'd transformed him from someone who was dying of suffocation into someone who could breathe and speak, even if he still felt terrible. "What hospital?" Velma asked Luther, who was still hovering nearby like he felt personally responsible for Clifford's welfare. "Rockbridge Community is closest," Luther replied. "Maybe 20 minutes from here." "That'll work. They've got a good emergency department." She was loading additional supplies into the ambulance while talking, preparing for whatever complications might arise during transport. "Sir, we're going to move you to the stretcher now. Try not to exert yourself. Let us do all the work." The transfer to the ambulance was surprisingly smooth, accomplished with the kind of coordinated effort that spoke to years of experience moving patients in various states of medical distress. Once they had him secured inside the vehicle, Velma began attaching monitoring equipment that would track his vital signs during the trip to the hospital. "You feeling any better?" she asked as her partner started driving, the ambulance pulling out of the gas station with lights flashing but sirens silent. "Some," Clifford admitted. "Throat's not as tight, but I still feel wrong, like my whole body's fighting against itself." "That's exactly what's happening. Your immune system decided that something in that trail mix was a threat and launched a full-scale attack against it. Problem is, the attack damages your own tissues in the process." As they drove toward the hospital, Velma continued to monitor his condition and administer additional medications designed to keep the reaction from bouncing back. She explained that severe allergic reactions could be unpredictable, sometimes appearing to resolve only to return with even greater intensity an hour or two later. "Have you been under any unusual stress lately?" she asked. "Sometimes that can trigger allergies that were dormant before." Clifford thought about his recent divorce, the financial pressure of maintaining 2 households, his daughter's college tuition bills, and the general uncertainty that seemed to characterize the trucking industry lately. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. Stress can definitely affect your immune system, make it more likely to overreact to things that wouldn't normally bother you." She checked his blood pressure again and made notes on a clipboard. "What kind of work do you do?" "Truck driver. Long haul, mostly up and down the East Coast." "That's stressful work. Irregular hours, poor diet, not much exercise, constant exposure to pollution and allergens from different regions." She was preparing another injection, this one smaller than the epinephrine shot. "This is a steroid that should help prevent the reaction from recurring over the next few hours." The ambulance was moving smoothly through the Virginia countryside, passing farms and forests that looked peaceful and normal in sharp contrast to the medical emergency playing out inside the vehicle. Through the small window, Clifford could see other trucks on the highway, their drivers probably unaware that one of their colleagues was fighting for his life just a few miles away. "Will I be able to drive again?" he asked, suddenly realizing that a severe food allergy might be incompatible with life on the road, where meal options were limited and ingredients were often unknown. "Depends on what specifically triggered this reaction," Velma replied. "If it's something common like peanuts, you'll need to be very careful about what you eat and always carry emergency medication. If it's something more obscure, it might not affect your daily life very much." The hospital appeared ahead of them,
a modern facility that looked capable of handling serious medical emergencies. As they pulled into the ambulance bay, Clifford could see medical staff already waiting for them, apparently having been alerted about an incoming allergic reaction case. "Here we go," Velma announced. "These folks are going to take excellent care of you. The main thing now is to identify exactly what caused the reaction so you can avoid it in the future." As they wheeled him into the emergency department, Clifford found himself thinking about that trail mix package, probably still sitting on the floor of his truck cab where he dropped it when the symptoms started. The innocent-looking snack that had nearly killed him within 30 minutes of consumption, transforming his routine day into a life-threatening medical emergency that could potentially end his trucking career. The emergency room was busy but well-organized, with staff members who seemed to know exactly what they were dealing with. A doctor who looked barely old enough to have finished medical school immediately took charge of his case, ordering blood tests and additional medications while explaining that they'd need to monitor him for at least 6 hours to ensure the reaction didn't return. "We're going to do some allergy testing to figure out exactly what triggered this," the doctor explained. "It's important that you know what to avoid, because subsequent reactions can be even more severe than the first one." As they transferred him to a hospital bed and began the process of comprehensive allergy evaluation, Clifford realized that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The simple act of eating a handful of trail mix had opened a door to a world where food could be a potential weapon, where every meal would require careful scrutiny of ingredients, and where the freedom to eat anywhere at any time, a freedom he'd never even thought about before, had been permanently taken away. The allergy testing took 4 hours and produced results that left the medical staff genuinely puzzled. Dr. Margaret Thornton, the allergist who'd been called in to consult on Clifford's case, sat beside his hospital bed with a clipboard full of test results and an expression that suggested she was looking at something she'd never seen before. "This is highly unusual," she admitted, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the data for the 3rd time. "Your blood work shows massive immune response typical of severe anaphylaxis, but we can't identify a specific allergen that triggered it." Clifford had been feeling progressively better over the past few hours, the combination of epinephrine, steroids, and antihistamines having reversed most of his symptoms. His breathing was normal, the swelling in his face and throat had gone down, and the red welts on his skin had faded to barely visible marks. But Dr. Thornton's words sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with his physical condition. "What do you mean you can't identify it?" he asked. "We tested you for all the common food allergens: peanuts, tree nuts, shellfish, eggs, milk, wheat, soy. Also tested for environmental allergens like pollen, dust mites, animal dander. Every test came back negative." She flipped through several pages of lab reports. "According to these results, you shouldn't be allergic to anything." The implications were deeply unsettling. If medical science couldn't identify what had nearly killed him, how could he avoid it in the future? How could he protect himself against something that couldn't be detected or predicted? "Maybe the trail mix was contaminated with something," Clifford suggested. "Pesticides or some kind of chemical residue from processing equipment." "That's possible, though it would be unusual for contamination to produce such a severe allergic response. We'd expect to see signs of toxicity rather than immune system overreaction." Dr. Thornton made additional notes on his chart. "Did you bring the package with you?" "It's still in my truck, I think, at that gas station where the ambulance picked me up. We should have someone retrieve it for analysis. In the meantime, I'm going to prescribe you an EpiPen auto-injector and some antihistamine tablets. If you experience any similar symptoms, use the EpiPen immediately and call 911. The nurse who brought his discharge paperwork also provided a brief education session on recognizing the early signs of allergic reactions and proper use of emergency medication. She was thorough and professional, but Clifford could sense an underlying concern that went beyond routine patient education. "Has something like this happened before?" he asked. Someone having a severe reaction to something that can't be identified? The nurse exchanged a glance with Dr. Thornton that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. "Every case is different," she replied diplomatically. "The important thing is that you know how to protect yourself now." After his discharge, Clifford took a taxi back to the gas station where his Freightliner was still parked beside the diesel pumps. Luther was working a different shift, but the afternoon attendant had heard about the morning's excitement and was eager to help retrieve the trail mix package from the truck cab. "That was some scary stuff," the attendant said, unlocking the cab door with the spare key Clifford had given to Luther earlier. "Never seen anything like that before. You're lucky you made it here when you did." The trail mix package was exactly where Clifford had dropped it, about half empty with the remaining contents scattered across the cab floor. He gathered everything into a plastic bag, being careful not to touch any of the nuts or dried fruit directly, then sealed it for transport back to the hospital. Dr. Thornton had given him her direct phone number and asked him to return with the package as soon as possible. When he called to let her know he had it, she requested that he bring it to the hospital's laboratory rather than the emergency department. "I want to fast-track the analysis," she explained. "Something about your case is bothering me, and I'd like to get some answers as quickly as possible." The laboratory was located in the basement of the hospital, a sterile environment of white tile and stainless steel that reminded Clifford uncomfortably of the morgues he'd seen in television crime shows. The technician who accepted the trail mix package wore gloves and handled it like it might be radioactive, immediately placing it in what appeared to be a containment unit. "We'll test for everything," Dr. Thornton assured him. "Pesticide residues, bacterial contamination, chemical adulterants, anything that might explain what happened to you. Results should be available within 48 hours." During the drive back to his truck, Clifford found himself studying every restaurant and convenience store he passed, wondering if he'd ever feel safe eating prepared food again. The simple act of grabbing a quick meal had become fraught with potential danger, transformed from routine necessity into calculated risk. His dispatcher at Consolidated Freight Solutions was understanding but concerned when Clifford called to explain why he'd be delayed completing his delivery. "Take all the time you need," Rosa Martinez told him. "Health comes first, and we've got insurance that covers medical emergencies. The customer will understand." But Clifford knew that missing delivery windows, even for legitimate medical reasons, could damage his reputation with both his company and their clients. The trucking industry operated on tight schedules and narrow profit margins that didn't accommodate unexpected delays, regardless of their cause. He spent that night in his sleeper berth at a truck stop near Staunton, afraid to eat anything except bottled water and crackers he'd purchased from 3 different vending machines to minimize the risk of contamination. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by phantom symptoms that made him reach for the EpiPen every time his throat felt dry or his skin itched. The next morning brought a call from Dr. Thornton that only deepened the mystery surrounding his allergic reaction. "The preliminary results are back," she said, and Clifford could hear the confusion in her voice. "The trail mix tests negative for all common contaminants. No pesticides, no bacterial growth, no chemical residues. As far as we can determine, it's exactly what it's supposed to be: nuts and dried fruit." "Then what nearly killed me?" "That's what we're trying to figure out. I've sent samples to the CDC for more sophisticated analysis, and I've also reached out to colleagues at other medical centers to see if they've encountered similar cases." The mention of the Centers for Disease Control sent an involuntary chill down Clifford's spine. If federal health authorities were being consulted, his case had moved beyond routine medical curiosity into something potentially significant for public health. "Am I contagious?" he asked, suddenly worried about exposing other people to whatever had affected him. "No, allergic reactions aren't communicable. But if there's some kind of novel allergen or contaminant involved, it could affect other people who consume similar products." Over the next several days, while waiting for the CDC analysis results,
Clifford attempted to continue his regular trucking routine with modifications that felt like elaborate safety protocols. He ate only at chain restaurants where ingredients were standardized and allergen information was readily available. He carried the EpiPen everywhere and checked its expiration date obsessively. He avoided all nuts, dried fruit, and anything else that remotely resembled what had been in the trail mix. But the precautions weren't enough to prevent what happened on Thursday evening. He'd stopped at a Cracker Barrel restaurant outside Richmond, choosing it specifically because their menu clearly identified potential allergens for every dish. He ordered grilled chicken with mashed potatoes and green beans, simple, familiar foods that posed minimal risk of triggering another reaction. The meal was uneventful until he was finishing the last few bites of mashed potatoes. The familiar burning sensation in his throat began so suddenly and intensely that he barely had time to grab the EpiPen from his jacket pocket before his airway started closing. This time he was prepared. The auto-injector delivered its dose of epinephrine within seconds of symptom onset, and he was dialing 911 even as the medication began taking effect. But the fact that he'd had another severe allergic reaction to something completely different from the original trail mix meant that whatever was happening to his immune system was far more serious than anyone had initially suspected. The ambulance crew that responded to the Cracker Barrel were familiar with his case. Apparently, Dr. Thornton had sent alerts to all the regional emergency medical services about a patient experiencing repeated episodes of severe anaphylaxis with unknown triggers. "Same guy from Monday?" asked the lead paramedic, whose name tag identified him as Rodriguez. "That's me," Clifford confirmed, his voice hoarse but functional thanks to the early intervention with epinephrine. "Doc Thornton wants us to bring you straight to her, not the emergency department," Rodriguez explained as they loaded him into the ambulance. "She's got some kind of special protocol set up for you." The special protocol turned out to be an isolation room in the hospital's infectious disease unit, equipped with air filtration systems and monitoring equipment that seemed excessive for treating allergic reactions. Dr. Thornton was waiting when they arrived, along with two other doctors Clifford didn't recognize and a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Hawthorne from the CDC. "We need to talk," Dr. Thornton said, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "The analysis of your trail mix came back from Atlanta this morning, and we found something that changes everything." Dr. Hawthorne opened a laptop computer and turned the screen toward Clifford. The display showed what appeared to be microscopic imagery, cellular structures that meant nothing to him, but which obviously had significant meaning to the medical professionals gathered around his bed. "What you're looking at is a previously unknown protein compound," Dr. Hawthorne explained. "It appears to be synthetic, possibly engineered, and designed to trigger immune responses in specific populations." "Engineered?" Clifford felt like he was suddenly part of a science fiction movie rather than a medical consultation. "You mean someone made this deliberately?" "That's what the evidence suggests. The protein structure doesn't match anything found in nature, and the manufacturing process appears to be extremely sophisticated." Dr. Hawthorne closed the laptop. "We believe you may have been exposed to an experimental biological agent, possibly without your knowledge or consent." The implications hit him like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately poisoned his food with something designed to cause severe allergic reactions. But why? And how many other people might have been exposed to the same substance? "The mashed potatoes at Cracker Barrel tested positive for the same compound," Dr. Thornton added, "which means either this substance is being distributed widely or someone is specifically targeting you." Targeting him. The phrase seemed to echo in the sterile air of the isolation room, transforming his medical emergency into something far more sinister. Someone wanted him dead, or at least seriously incapacitated, and they were using cutting-edge biotechnology to accomplish their goal. The isolation room felt like a prison designed by medical professionals, all sterile surfaces and monitoring equipment that beeped constantly. tracking every aspect of his bodily functions while he processed the impossible reality that someone had been systematically poisoning him with synthetic biological weapons. Dr. Hawthorne from the CDC had left to make phone calls to people whose names she didn't share, leaving Clifford alone with Dr. Thornton and a growing sense that his life had become part of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple trucking accident. "How many other people might be affected?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "That's what we're trying to determine," Dr. Thornton replied, checking her tablet for what must have been the 10th time in the past hour. "The good news is that this synthetic protein appears to be highly targeted. It's not something that would affect the general population indiscriminately." "Targeted how?" "Based on genetic markers, possibly, or specific health profiles. The CDC is analyzing your DNA to see if there's something unique about your immune system that makes you susceptible to this particular compound." The concept of genetic targeting sounded like something from a dystopian movie, but Dr. Thornton discussed it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing routine medical procedures. Apparently, the technology for creating personalized biological weapons was further advanced than most people realized. "Why would someone want to kill me specifically?" Clifford asked, though he'd been wondering the same thing since learning that his poisoning was deliberate. "I'm just a truck driver. I don't have any enemies, don't owe anybody money, never been involved in anything controversial." Dr. Thornton set down her tablet and studied him with the kind of intense attention usually reserved for complex diagnoses. "Tell me about your routes. Where do you typically drive? What kind of cargo you haul? Whether you've noticed anything unusual about your runs lately?" "Mostly automotive parts, sometimes electronics. South Carolina to Pennsylvania and back, twice a month for the past 4 years. Same customers, same loading docks, same truck stops." Clifford tried to think of anything that might have changed recently. "The only thing different was that my regular dispatcher retired last month, and they brought in someone new to handle my account." "What's the new dispatcher's name?" "Rebecca Williams, but she seems fine. Professional, good at her job. I can't imagine she'd have any reason to." He stopped, realizing how naive that sounded given what he'd learned about the sophisticated nature of his poisoning. Dr. Thornton made notes on a legal pad. "We'll need to investigate everyone who has access to your route information, cargo manifests, and personal details. This kind of targeted biological attack requires extensive planning and detailed knowledge about the victim's habits and schedule." The phrase, biological attack, sent another chill through him. It suggested military or intelligence operations, the kind of shadow warfare he'd only read about in spy novels. But apparently those fictional scenarios had become his real-world reality. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Hawthorne returned with 2 men in dark suits who introduced themselves as Special Agents Morrison and Kelly from the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit. Their presence transformed the medical consultation into what felt like a criminal investigation. "Mr. Clifford Morrison," Agent Morrison began, then stopped and smiled slightly. "Sorry, that's confusing. Mr. Morrison, I'm Agent Morrison. We need to ask you some questions about your work history and personal relationships." The interrogation, because that's what it was, despite the polite terminology, lasted 3 hours and covered every aspect of his life in exhaustive detail. His divorce, his relationship with his ex-wife and daughter, his employment history, his financial situation, his political affiliations, his social media activity, even his medical records going back to childhood. The agents were particularly interested in his military service 25 years earlier, when he'd been a mechanic with the Army Transportation Corps. They wanted to know about his security clearance, the bases where he'd worked, and whether he'd ever been exposed to classified information or experimental technology. "This was all routine stuff," Clifford insisted. "I fixed trucks and generators, nothing secret or important enough that someone would want to kill me decades later." Sometimes people don't realize the significance of what they've seen until much later, Agent Kelly explained. Information that seemed routine at the time might have gained importance due to subsequent events. They were fishing, hoping he'd remember something that would explain why he'd become a target for sophisticated biological warfare. But despite hours of detailed questioning, nothing emerged that seemed relevant to his current situation. The agents left around midnight, promising to return the next day with additional questions and requesting that he remain in the hospital's isolation unit for his own protection. The phrase protective custody wasn't used, but the implications were clear. He was considered to be in ongoing danger from whoever had poisoned him. Sleep was impossible under those circumstances. Every sound in the hallway made him wonder if his attackers had somehow infiltrated the hospital. Every medical staff member who entered his room was scrutinized for signs of hostile intent. The EpiPen on his bedside table had become a security blanket that provided minimal comfort against threats that seemed to transcend normal human experience. At 3 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions, or the next dose will be fatal." The threat was straightforward and terrifying, but what made it worse was the timing. Whoever had sent it knew exactly where he was and what was happening to him, despite the FBI's presence and the hospital's security measures. They were monitoring him in real time, possibly through electronic surveillance or human assets embedded in the investigation. He called Agent Morrison immediately, reading the message verbatim and providing the sending number. The agent's response was swift and professional. "Don't respond to the text. We're tracing it now. Hospital security is being increased, and we're moving you to a more secure facility in the morning." The secure facility turned out to be a CDC laboratory in Atlanta, housed within a complex that looked more like a military installation than a medical research center. Clifford's transportation there involved a chartered medical flight with armed escorts and security protocols that made him feel like a witness in a high-profile criminal case. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the CDC specialist who took over his case, was a thin woman in her 50s with the kind of intense focus that suggested she'd spent her career dealing with biological threats to national security. Her laboratory was equipped with technology that could analyze synthetic proteins at the molecular level and track their distribution through various food supply chains. "We found traces of the same compound in food samples from 6 other locations along your regular route," she reported during his first briefing at the Atlanta facility. "All establishments that you've patronized regularly over the past 4 months." The scope of the contamination was staggering. Someone had been methodically introducing synthetic allergens into his food supply for months, gradually building up his sensitivity until a normal serving size would trigger a life-threatening reaction. "But why?" Clifford asked for what felt like the 100th time. "What could I possibly know or have done that would justify this kind of elaborate attack?" Dr. Reeves pulled up files on her computer screen. "We think it might be related to something you saw during your military service, but not what you consciously remember seeing. Sometimes people witness things without realizing their significance, and those memories can be recovered through specialized techniques." The idea of recovered memories made him deeply uncomfortable, conjuring images of psychological manipulation and false memory syndrome. But if it was the only way to understand why someone wanted him dead, he didn't have much choice. The memory recovery sessions began the next morning, conducted by Dr. Amanda Foster, a neuropsychologist who specialized in helping people recall suppressed traumatic experiences. The process involved a combination of hypnosis, guided visualization, and pharmaceutical assistance that was supposed to lower his psychological defenses without compromising the accuracy of his recollections. "We're looking for anything unusual you might have encountered during your time at Fort Bragg," Dr. Foster explained as she prepared the injection that would make him more receptive to hypnotic suggestions. Equipment, people, conversations, documents, anything that seemed out of place or didn't make sense at the time. The drug, something called sodium pentothal, combined with a mild hallucinogen, produced a dreamlike state where past and present seemed to blend together in ways that felt both terrifying and enlightening. Under its influence, memories that had been buried for decades began surfacing with startling clarity. He remembered working late one night in the motor pool, replacing a transmission in a specialized vehicle that wasn't part of the standard military inventory. The truck had looked normal from the outside, but the engine compartment contained electronic equipment that seemed far too sophisticated for a simple transportation vehicle. Two men in civilian clothes had been supervising the work, speaking in low voices about delivery schedules and payload specifications. At the time, Clifford had assumed they were contractors involved in some kind of routine military logistics operation. But under hypnosis, he could recall fragments of their conversation that suggested something much more significant. "The Berlin samples need to be in Washington by Friday," one of them had said. "Moscow won't wait beyond the weekend, and we can't afford any delays in the exchange." Berlin, Moscow, Washington. Even 25 years later, those words carried implications that made his blood run cold. He'd apparently been involved in modifying vehicles used to transport something between Cold War adversaries, possibly biological or chemical weapons that were being secretly exchanged for intelligence purposes. "The Syrian variant is ready for field testing," the other man had added. "But we'll need to modify the delivery system to avoid detection by standard screening protocols." Syrian variant, delivery system, field testing. The terminology had meant nothing to a 23-year-old Army mechanic focused on completing his assigned repairs, but it obviously had enormous significance for someone tracking his involvement decades later. Under continued hypnosis, more memories emerged. License plate numbers, shipping manifest codes, overheard phone conversations about biological weapons research being conducted at undisclosed locations. He'd been present during multiple conversations about experimental compounds designed to target specific populations based on genetic markers. When the session ended, Dr. Foster had filled several notebooks with details that painted a picture of his unwitting involvement in Cold War biological weapons development. The trucks he'd modified had apparently been used to transport experimental agents between research facilities, and he'd overheard enough classified information to potentially compromise ongoing operations. "Someone believes you know more than you've revealed," Dr. Reeves explained after reviewing the session notes. "They think you might have documentation, photographs, or other evidence that could expose their historical activities." "But I don't have anything," Clifford protested. "I was just a mechanic doing my job. I never took pictures or made copies of documents." "They can't be sure of that. From their perspective, you're a potential witness to activities that could result in criminal prosecutions or international incidents if they became public. The safest approach would be to eliminate you before you remember enough to become a threat." The casual way she discussed his murder as a logical business decision was almost as disturbing as the original poisoning attempts. Apparently, the intersection of biological weapons research and national security created environments where human life became just another variable in complex strategic calculations. The protection protocols at the CDC facility were comprehensive, but couldn't shield Clifford from the psychological impact of learning that his entire adult life had been built on a foundation of buried memories and suppressed knowledge. The hypnosis sessions continued for another week, each one uncovering additional details about his unwitting involvement in biological weapons research during the mid-1990s. Dr. Foster's techniques were remarkably effective at recovering specific information that had been locked away in his subconscious for decades. Under pharmaceutical-assisted hypnosis, he could recall serial numbers from the electronic equipment he'd seen, partial names from conversations he'd overheard, even fragments of shipping documents he'd glimpsed while performing routine maintenance on those modified vehicles. "The codename Project Chimera keeps appearing in your recovered memories," Dr. Foster noted after the 5th session. "Do you have any conscious recollection of hearing that term?" Clifford shook his head, though the name produced a vague sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. Nothing specific. Maybe I heard it mentioned, but I wouldn't have understood its significance at the time. Dr. Reeves was reviewing classified documents that had been declassified for their investigation, cross-referencing his recovered memories with historical records of biological weapons research conducted during that period. The picture that emerged was disturbing on multiple levels. Project Chimera was a joint CIA military operation focused on developing ethnically targeted biological weapons, she explained during one of their briefings. The idea was to create synthetic compounds that would affect specific genetic populations, while leaving others unharmed. The concept was horrifying in its implications. Biological weapons designed to commit genocide on a molecular level, targeting people based on their DNA rather than their nationality or religion. It represented the intersection of cutting-edge biotechnology with humanity's darkest impulses. Your recovered memories suggest that the vehicles you modified were being used to transport test subjects between research facilities. Dr. Reeves continued. Some of those subjects may have been American citizens who were never informed about their participation in the experiments. American citizens. The phrase hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just been maintaining vehicles used for weapons research. He'd been facilitating human experimentation on his own countrymen, possibly including people who'd been deliberately infected with synthetic pathogens to test their effectiveness. The good news, if you can call it that, is that Project Chimera was officially terminated in 1997 following a congressional investigation, Dr. Reeves said. The bad news is that some of the researchers apparently continued their work through private contractors and foreign partnerships. That explained why someone would want him dead more than 2 decades after his military service ended. If former Project Chimera scientists were still conducting illegal biological weapons research, they'd have strong incentives to eliminate anyone who could potentially expose their activities. We think the synthetic protein that's been used to poison you is based on research that began during Project Chimera, Dr. Reeves added. It shows the same targeting characteristics and molecular structure as compounds that were being developed in the mid-1990s. The irony was devastating. He was being slowly murdered using technology he'd unknowingly helped develop, killed by the same people whose research he'd facilitated through his vehicle maintenance work. His attackers weren't random criminals or foreign agents. They were American scientists who viewed him as a liability to be eliminated. The FBI agents returned to Atlanta with additional evidence that painted an even more disturbing picture of the conspiracy. They'd traced the synthetic protein to a private research laboratory in North Carolina that employed several former Project Chimera scientists, and they'd identified at least 3 other former military personnel who died under suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years. All of them had some connection to biological weapons research during their service. Agent Morrison explained during a briefing that felt more like a war council than a medical consultation. And all of them died from what appeared to be severe allergic reactions to common foods. 3 other people, murdered using the same sophisticated biotechnology that was slowly killing him, eliminated because their memories posed potential threats to people who'd continued illegal research long after Project Chimera was officially terminated. We're building a criminal case, but it's going to take time, Agent Kelly added. These people are extremely sophisticated, and they've had decades to perfect their methods. In the meantime, you're going to need to remain in protective custody. Protective custody meant living in a CDC containment facility indefinitely, eating only pre-approved foods that had been tested for synthetic contaminants, and accepting that his life as a truck driver was effectively over. The synthetic protein had made him hypersensitive to a wide range of potential allergens, and subsequent exposures could be fatal even with immediate medical intervention. Dr. Reeves had been working on developing an antidote, but the process was complicated by the sophisticated nature of the synthetic compound. It's designed to integrate with your immune system in ways that make it extremely difficult to neutralize, she explained. We're essentially trying to reprogram your body's natural defense mechanisms. The experimental treatments were as dangerous as the original poisoning. high-dose immunosuppressive drugs that left him vulnerable to infections, synthetic antibodies that produced their own allergic reactions, and gene therapy techniques that were still in early clinical trials. Each attempt to cure him created new health risks that sometimes seemed worse than the original problem. After 2 months in the Atlanta facility, Clifford had lost 30 pounds and developed complications from the various treatments that left him weaker than he'd been before the poisoning began. The synthetic protein continued to circulate in his bloodstream, apparently designed to resist normal metabolic processes that would have eliminated a natural toxin. "We may need to consider more aggressive options," Dr. Reeves said during one of their consultations, though her tone suggested she wasn't optimistic about the prospects. "Bone marrow transplant to completely replace your immune system, or experimental procedures that haven't been tested on humans." The alternatives were becoming a choice between different ways of dying. The synthetic protein would eventually kill him through repeated allergic reactions, but the treatments designed to save him carried their own potentially fatal risks. He was trapped in a medical nightmare created by people who'd spent decades perfecting the art of untraceable murder. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Thornton, the allergist who'd first treated him in Virginia, had been conducting her own research into the synthetic protein's molecular structure. Working with a team of biochemists at Johns Hopkins, she'd identified a potential weakness in its design. The protein is engineered to mimic natural allergens, but it has to maintain structural stability in various environmental conditions, she explained during a video conference with the Atlanta team. "We think we can exploit that requirement by using targeted enzymes that will break down the synthetic components while leaving your natural immune function intact." The enzyme therapy was risky and unproven, but it offered the first real hope for recovery that didn't involve procedures with mortality rates approaching 50%. After extensive consultation with medical ethicists and obtaining experimental treatment approval from the FDA, they decided to proceed with the new protocol. The treatment involved weekly infusions of synthetic enzymes designed to target the artificial protein structure. The first few sessions produced no obvious effects, but blood tests showed gradual reduction in the concentration of the synthetic compound. More importantly, controlled exposure tests indicated that his hypersensitivity was slowly diminishing. "It's working," Dr. Thornton announced after the 8th treatment session. "Your reaction to test allergens is approaching normal levels, and we can't detect any synthetic protein in your latest blood work." Recovery was slow and incomplete. Even with the artificial compound eliminated from his system, months of immunosuppressive treatment had left him vulnerable to infections and autoimmune complications that required ongoing medical management. His trucking career was over. The physical demands and irregular schedule were incompatible with his need for consistent medical care. The criminal investigation had progressed during his treatment, resulting in federal indictments against 12 people involved in continuing illegal biological weapons research. The North Carolina laboratory had been shut down, and several of its scientists were facing charges that carried potential life sentences. But the prosecution team warned him that other cells of former Project Chimera researchers might still be active, and that eliminating one laboratory didn't necessarily end the threat to his life or the lives of other potential witnesses. "You'll need to maintain a low profile indefinitely," Agent Morrison explained during one of their final meetings. "New identity, relocated residence, regular security briefings. The people we've arrested represent only one part of a much larger network." 6 months after eating a handful of trail mix from a highway rest stop, Clifford Morrison officially ceased to exist. The man who took his place lived in a modest apartment in Seattle, worked as a security guard at a medical facility, and carried an EpiPen even though his allergies had been artificially induced by people who'd wanted him dead. Sometimes he wondered how many other Americans had been secretly poisoned by their own government's researchers, and how many had died without ever understanding what was killing them. The intersection of advanced biotechnology with classified military research had created possibilities for murder that were essentially undetectable using conventional investigative methods. He'd survived because his poisoning had been discovered early enough to develop countermeasures, and because dedicated medical professionals had been willing to risk their careers on experimental treatments. But somewhere in America, other former Project Chimera witnesses were probably dying mysterious deaths that would never be connected to biological weapons research conducted decades earlier. The synthetic protein that had nearly killed him represented just one example of technologies that had been developed in secret government laboratories and later adapted for use by private contractors who answered to no oversight authority. The people responsible for his poisoning had spent years perfecting their methods, and they probably had access to other synthetic compounds designed to cause different types of deaths that would appear completely natural. His new life was safe but hollow, built on a foundation of artificial identity documents and carefully constructed cover stories. He could never contact his daughter or ex-wife, never return to the highways that had been his home for 4 years, never trust that any food he ate hadn't been contaminated by people who still viewed him as a potential threat to their continued freedom. The trail mix package that had started everything was probably still sitting in some CDC laboratory freezer, a piece of evidence in a case that would never go to trial because too many of the defendants had connections that reached into the highest levels of government. Justice, like his old identity, had become another casualty of technologies that existed in the shadows beyond public accountability. On quiet nights in his Seattle apartment, when the rain drummed against his windows and the city lights reflected off the wet streets below, he sometimes wondered if the young Army mechanic who'd worked on those trucks 25 years ago would have made different choices if he'd understood what he was really facilitating. But he knew the answer. That version of himself had been too young and naive to comprehend the implications, just as most people remained unaware of the darker possibilities that emerged when human ingenuity was applied to the ancient art of killing. Clarence Hutchins should have known better than to ignore the weather warnings, but 22 years of driving 18-wheelers through every kind of East Coast winter had made him overconfident about his ability to handle whatever nature could throw at him. The forecast had called for heavy snow across northern Pennsylvania and southern New York, but it was only the third week of January 2021, and he'd driven through much worse conditions during his decades on the road. His Kenworth W900 was built for severe weather operations, equipped with snow chains, extra fuel capacity, and a sleeper berth heating system that had never failed him during even the coldest nights. The load he was hauling, industrial machinery from a factory in Pittsburgh to a construction site in Albany, was valuable enough that the customer had offered a substantial bonus for on-time delivery, despite the weather conditions. Clarence was 58 years old, a grandfather of 4 who'd planned to retire in a few years once his youngest grandchild finished high school. He owned his truck outright, had a solid reputation with shipping companies throughout the Northeast, and maintained the kind of financial stability that allowed him to be selective about the loads he accepted. But the machinery shipment was paying almost double his usual rates, and his wife Martha had mentioned wanting to take a cruise for their 40th wedding anniversary. The storm hit harder and faster than anyone had predicted. He'd left Pittsburgh at 4 a.m. under clear skies, making good time through the Pennsylvania countryside as the sun rose over rolling hills covered with a light dusting of snow from the previous week. The CB radio crackled with routine traffic, other drivers reporting road conditions, warning about speed traps, sharing information about truck stop amenities along various routes. By 9 a.m., when he stopped for fuel and coffee at a travel center near Scranton, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. Large, wet flakes that stuck to his windshield but weren't coming down heavily enough to cause serious visibility problems. The fuel attendant, a cheerful young woman who knew most of the regular drivers by name, mentioned that the Weather Service had upgraded their snow warning to a blizzard watch. "Supposed to get really bad afternoon," she said. wiping snow off her uniform jacket. "You might want to consider parking it until this blows over." Clarence checked his GPS unit, which showed he was still 4 hours from Albany under normal driving conditions. Even allowing for reduced speeds due to weather, he could make his delivery by early afternoon and find a place to ride out the worst of the storm in comfort. The bonus payment was too significant to pass up for what might turn out to be just another routine winter weather event. "I'll keep an eye on it," he told the attendant, signing his fuel receipt. "Got good equipment and plenty of experience with snow." The snowfall intensified as he continued north on Interstate 380, but his truck's traction control system and the weight of his loaded trailer provided excellent stability on the increasingly slippery pavement. Other drivers were reducing their speeds and increasing following distances, creating the kind of cautious convoy that typically formed during winter weather events. Around 11 a.m., the snow began falling heavily enough to activate his windshield wipers on continuous cycle. Visibility dropped to maybe a quarter mile, but the road surface was still manageable with careful driving. His CB radio was busy with reports from drivers throughout the region, most of them describing similar conditions: heavy snow, but passable roads for experienced truckers with proper equipment. That changed quickly after noon. The blizzard arrived like someone had flipped a switch, transforming moderate snowfall into a wall of white that reduced visibility to less than 50 feet. Wind gusts strong enough to rock his 40-ton rig began hitting from multiple directions, and the road surface became treacherous despite the efforts of snowplows that were struggling to keep up with the accumulation rate. Clarence slowed to 30 miles per hour, then 25, then 20 as conditions continued to deteriorate. His truck's headlights reflected off the snow like beams shining into fog, creating more glare than illumination. The center line of the highway disappeared beneath accumulating snow, making it difficult to maintain proper lane position. Other drivers were making similar adjustments, and the convoy of trucks and cars crept through the Pennsylvania mountains like a procession of ghosts. Several vehicles had already pulled off at rest areas or truck stops to wait out the storm, but Clarence was still confident in his ability to reach Albany safely if he maintained appropriate caution. The first sign of serious trouble came when he tried to climb the grade approaching the New York state line. His truck, which normally handled hills with ease, began losing traction as the snow depth increased, and the road surface became more like an ice skating rink than pavement. The engine worked harder, but forward progress slowed to maybe 10 miles per hour, even with chains engaged. Halfway up the grade, his truck began sliding backwards. The sensation was terrifying and disorienting, feeling 40 tons of truck and trailer losing their grip on the road and starting to slip downhill despite maximum engine power and properly functioning brakes. Clarence had experienced minor traction problems before, but nothing like this complete loss of forward momentum. He managed to steer onto the shoulder before the backward slide became dangerous, but now he was stuck. The truck's drive wheels spun uselessly in snow that had accumulated to a depth that overwhelmed even his heavy-duty tire chains. Worse, the shoulder wasn't level. His truck was positioned at an angle that would make getting back onto the roadway extremely difficult, even with traction. The CB radio crackled with reports from other drivers describing similar problems throughout the region. Several trucks were stuck at various locations, and the state police were advising all commercial vehicles to seek shelter immediately rather than attempting to continue through the blizzard. "Road conditions have deteriorated beyond safe driving limits," came the official announcement. "Interstate 380 is now closed to all traffic north of Scranton. Repeat, I-380 is closed. All drivers should seek immediate shelter." Clarence found himself stranded on a highway shoulder in the middle of a blizzard that was rapidly becoming the worst winter storm he'd encountered in over 2 decades of professional driving. His truck's engine was still running, the heating system was working properly, and he had enough fuel to idle for at least 12 hours. The situation was inconvenient but not immediately dangerous. That assessment changed over the next few hours as conditions continued to worsen. By 3 p.m., snow had accumulated high enough to block his truck's exhaust system, forcing him to shut down the engine to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. The temperature inside his sleeper berth began dropping immediately, and he realized that his heating system would be useless until the exhaust could be cleared. He tried to dig out the exhaust pipe using a small shovel from his emergency kit, but the snow was falling so heavily that his efforts were futile. Within minutes of clearing a path, new accumulation would block the system again. The wind was driving the snow horizontally, creating drifts that were already several feet deep around his truck. The temperature continued to drop inside the cab as thermal mass from the warm engine dissipated. Clarence put on additional layers of clothing from his travel bag and wrapped himself in the sleeping bag he kept for emergencies. But he could feel the cold seeping through the metal walls of his sleeper berth. By 5 p.m., his breath was visible inside the truck. The CB radio was still functional, powered by his truck's batteries, and he used it to call for assistance from the state police or emergency services. The responses were discouraging. Multiple trucks were stranded throughout the region, snow plows couldn't operate in the current conditions, and rescue crews were dealing with numerous emergencies that took priority over drivers who were stuck but not in immediate medical danger. "Sit tight and stay warm," advised the dispatcher, whose voice crackled through the static. "We'll get to everyone as soon as conditions allow, but it might be several hours." Several hours. In a truck that was rapidly becoming as cold as a walk-in freezer, with outside temperatures dropping below zero and wind chill values that were probably well into dangerous territory. Clarence tried to start his engine periodically to generate heat, but each attempt resulted in the same problem. Snow accumulation would block the exhaust within minutes, forcing him to shut down again to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning. He was trapped in a thermal prison that was slowly but steadily draining away his body heat. As darkness fell, the situation became more desperate. The blizzard showed no signs of weakening, and new snow continued to pile up around his truck. Through his side windows, when he could see anything through the swirling snow, it looked like he was buried in a white cocoon that was getting deeper by the hour. The CB radio brought occasional updates from other stranded drivers, most of them reporting similar problems with exhaust blockage and heating system failures. A few had managed to keep their engines running by going outside every hour to clear snow, but that approach required enormous physical effort in dangerous conditions. "Driver about 10 miles south of my position just went silent," reported someone whose voice Clarence didn't recognize. "Been trying to raise him for the past hour. Might be in trouble." Going silent. In trucker terminology, that usually meant medical emergency or equipment failure serious enough to prevent radio communication. Given the current conditions, neither possibility was comforting to contemplate. By 8 p.m., Clarence was shivering constantly despite wearing every piece of clothing he'd brought with him. The sleeping bag helped, but his feet and hands were becoming uncomfortably cold, and he could feel his core body temperature beginning to drop. The mathematical reality was stark. Without heating, his truck's interior would eventually reach the same temperature as the outside air, which weather reports suggested was approaching -10 degrees Fahrenheit. He tried to stay active, doing push-ups and jumping jacks in the limited space of his sleeper berth, but physical activity only helped temporarily. The truck's metal construction conducted heat away from his body faster than he could generate it through exercise. The CB radio crackled with a familiar voice. Melvin Garrett, a dispatcher for the state police who'd been coordinating emergency responses throughout the region. "All stranded drivers. This is Melvin with State Emergency Services. Current conditions are preventing any rescue operations until at least dawn tomorrow. Repeat, no rescue operations possible until morning at the earliest. Conserve body heat and stay hydrated. Do not attempt to leave your vehicles." Dawn tomorrow. That was at least 10 hours away, assuming the blizzard subsided enough to allow emergency crews to operate. 10 hours in a freezing truck cab, with outside temperatures that could potentially be life-threatening for someone without adequate heating. Clarence had read about hypothermia in the safety materials provided by his trucking company, but the clinical descriptions hadn't prepared him for the reality of feeling his body slowly losing its ability to maintain normal temperature. His thinking was beginning to feel sluggish, and he was having difficulty focusing on simple tasks like operating his CB radio. By 10 p.m., Clarence had entered a state where his body's response to cold was beginning to override his conscious thought processes. The constant shivering had evolved into violent tremors that made simple tasks like operating his CB radio increasingly difficult. His fingers felt thick and clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else, and his coordination was deteriorating in ways that reminded him of being severely intoxicated. The truck's interior temperature had dropped to maybe 20 degrees above zero, cold enough that his breath formed clouds that lingered in the air before dissipating. The sleeping bag that had initially provided some comfort was now inadequate against the relentless cold that seemed to seep through every surface of his sleeper berth. Clarence understood intellectually that he was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia, but that knowledge felt abstract and disconnected from his immediate experience. His thinking was becoming sluggish and confused in ways that made it difficult to develop coherent plans for improving his situation. He tried repeatedly to dig out his exhaust pipe so he could run the engine for heat, but each trip outside was a nightmare of howling wind and snow so dense it was like being blind. The accumulated snow around his truck was now deeper than his waist, and the physical effort required to move it was enormous. Worse, the exposure to wind and sub-zero temperatures during these digging attempts actually made him colder than staying inside the cab. The CB radio continued to crackle with periodic updates from other stranded drivers and emergency services, but fewer voices were participating in the conversations. Several drivers who'd been regular contributors to the radio chatter had gone silent, which might mean their radio batteries had died, or that they were conserving energy, or that they were experiencing medical emergencies. "This is Melvin again with State Emergency Services," came the familiar dispatcher's voice through heavy static. "Current temperature is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill values approaching minus 40. All stranded motorists should focus on conserving body heat. Do not exert yourself unnecessarily. Help is coming, but conditions are still too severe for rescue operations." Minus 40 wind chill. The numbers were beyond Clarence's previous experience with winter weather, even after more than 2 decades of driving through every kind of East Coast storm. His truck had never been designed to protect human life in conditions this extreme without a functioning heating system. Around midnight, he began experiencing symptoms that scared him more than the cold itself. His thinking became confused in ways that went beyond simple sluggishness. He found himself forgetting where he was, or why he was there, or what he needed to do to stay alive. Sometimes he caught himself staring at the radio or his watch without remembering what he'd been trying to accomplish. The confusion was accompanied by an almost irresistible urge to sleep. Despite understanding that falling asleep in these conditions could be fatal, his body craved unconsciousness with an intensity that made staying awake require enormous mental effort. He forced himself to remain active, doing jumping jacks and push-ups in the cramped space of his sleeper berth, but the exercises left him exhausted rather than warmed. More disturbing than the physical symptoms were the changes in his thought processes. He began having conversations with people who weren't there: his wife Martha, his dispatcher back in Pittsburgh, even his father who'd been dead for 15 years. The conversations felt completely real at the time, but when he tried to remember what had been said, the details dissolved like fragments of dreams. "Stay with me, Clarence," he said aloud, using the sound of his own voice to anchor himself to reality. "Keep talking. Keep thinking. Don't let the cold win." But his voice sounded strange to his own ears, slurred and distant, as if it was coming from someone else. The act of speaking required conscious effort to coordinate his mouth and tongue properly, and he had to concentrate on forming each word clearly. The CB radio brought periodic updates throughout the night, though he was having increasing difficulty understanding what was being said. The voices seemed to come from very far away, and sometimes he couldn't tell if what he was hearing was real radio traffic or hallucinations produced by his compromised brain function. Around 2 a.m., he heard a voice that might have been another stranded driver calling for help. "Can't feel my hands anymore," the voice said through heavy static. "Think I might be in serious trouble here. Anybody copy?" Clarence tried to respond, but his hands were shaking too badly to operate the radio properly. By the time he managed to key the microphone, the other driver had stopped transmitting. He never heard that voice again. The night became a blur of fragmented consciousness punctuated by increasingly vivid hallucinations. Sometimes he was back in his childhood home in West Virginia, sitting by the wood stove while his mother cooked dinner. Other times he was driving his truck through summer heat, windows down and warm air flowing through the cab. The hallucinations were so realistic that returning to the cold reality of his stranded truck was like waking from beautiful dreams into a nightmare. Around 4 a.m., his body stopped shivering. The sudden cessation of the violent tremors that had been racking his body for hours felt like relief at first, but some part of his mind recognized that this was actually a sign of advanced hypothermia. His core body temperature had dropped low enough that his body was no longer able to generate the muscle contractions necessary for shivering. Without that mechanism for producing heat, his condition would deteriorate rapidly. He was entering the stage of hypothermia where his heart could stop beating, where his brain function could be permanently damaged, where death became not just possible but probable if his body temperature continued to fall. He forced himself to remain active, but movement was becoming increasingly difficult as his muscles stiffened and his coordination deteriorated further. Simple tasks like putting on additional clothing or adjusting his position in the sleeping bag required enormous mental effort and physical struggle. The CB radio crackled with Melvin's voice again, though the words seemed to come from an impossible distance. "First light is still 3 hours away. Hang in there, everybody. Snow plows are standing by to begin operations as soon as visibility improves." 3 more hours. The information penetrated his confused thoughts like a physical blow. 3 hours of continued exposure to temperatures that were already overwhelming his body's ability to maintain life-sustaining functions. Clarence tried to calculate whether he could survive that long, but the mathematics were beyond his current cognitive abilities. Numbers and time concepts that would normally be simple became impossibly complex when processed by a brain that was running on severely reduced blood flow and oxygen. He found himself thinking about his funeral, about whether Martha would be able to manage the trucking business paperwork after he died, about whether his grandchildren would remember him as more than just a cautionary tale about the dangers of winter driving. The thoughts felt premature. He wasn't dead yet, but also oddly comforting, as if planning his own demise was a form of control over circumstances that had become completely beyond his influence. Around 5 a.m., he began experiencing what felt like warmth spreading through his body. The sensation was wonderful after hours of bone-deep cold, and his first impulse was gratitude that his body's heating systems were finally beginning to function again. But as the false warmth intensified, some surviving portion of his rational mind recognized that this was actually the most dangerous stage of hypothermia, the point where victims often remove their clothing because their confused brains interpret severe cold as heat. Fighting against the overwhelming urge to shed layers of clothing, Clarence forced himself to remain bundled in his sleeping bag and winter gear. The effort required to resist his body's demands was enormous, like holding his breath underwater while every instinct screamed at him to surface for air. The false sensation of warmth was accompanied by vivid hallucinations that were more realistic than anything he'd experienced during the earlier stages of hypothermia. He could see his truck's heater working perfectly, feel warm air flowing through the vents, hear the familiar sounds of a properly functioning engine. The illusions were so convincing that he had to repeatedly check the dashboard to confirm that the engine wasn't actually running. Sometime after 6 a.m., he lost the ability to distinguish between reality and hallucination. The boundaries between his actual situation and the products of his hypothermic brain became completely fluid. He was simultaneously stranded in a freezing truck and driving through warm summer weather. He was talking to Martha on his cell phone while also experiencing the silence of his powerless communications equipment. He was dying of cold while also feeling perfectly comfortable and safe. The dual existence was exhausting in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. Maintaining any connection to reality required enormous mental effort, and he found himself increasingly willing to surrender to the more pleasant hallucinations rather than fighting to stay grounded in the harsh facts of his situation. Through the chaos of confused thoughts and false sensations, he became dimly aware of sounds that might be real rather than imagined. The rumble of heavy equipment, voices calling through the wind, lights moving outside his truck that weren't part of his hallucinations. Help might be arriving, but his ability to respond to rescue efforts was almost completely compromised. His hands wouldn't work properly, his voice was barely functional, and his thinking was too disorganized to communicate coherently with potential rescuers. As dawn approached, Clarence's consciousness became increasingly fragmented, splitting between the reality of his desperate situation and a growing collection of memories, dreams, and hallucinations that felt more real than the cold truck where his body was slowly shutting down. The sounds became clearer as dawn finally arrived. The deep rumble of snow plows, the higher pitch of emergency vehicle sirens, and human voices calling through the wind. Clarence's rational mind tried to process this information as evidence that help was finally coming, but his hypothermic brain struggled to distinguish between real sensory input and the increasingly vivid hallucinations that had been tormenting him for hours. Through the frosted windows of his sleeper berth, he could see flashing lights that moved in patterns too organized to be products of his imagination. Red and blue strobes reflected off the swirling snow, creating a light show that his confused visual processing system found simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. "Help!" he tried to call out, but his voice was barely a whisper, and his throat felt raw from breathing the frigid air. Even if rescuers were nearby, they wouldn't be able to hear him through the truck's walls and the howling wind that continued to drive snow horizontally across the landscape. The effort of trying to attract attention exhausted him further, and he found himself slipping back into the disorienting mix of memories and hallucinations that had characterized the worst hours of his ordeal. Sometimes he was 8 years old again, building snow forts with his brother in the backyard of their childhood home. Other times he was a young soldier stationed in Alaska, learning survival techniques that might have saved his life if he could remember them clearly enough to apply them. A loud banging sound penetrated his confused consciousness, metal striking metal with the deliberate rhythm of someone trying to get his attention. The sound was too regular and persistent to be wind-driven debris, and it seemed to be coming from directly outside his cab. "Driver, can you hear me?" The voice was muffled but clearly human, carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to emergency situations. "If you're conscious, try to make some noise." Clarence attempted to respond, but his hands were too stiff and numb to bang on the walls or windows effectively. The best he could manage was a weak knocking sound that probably wasn't audible over the wind and the rumble of rescue equipment. "Got someone alive in here," the voice called to others. "Bring the cutting tools and medical gear." Cutting tools. They were going to have to break into his truck to reach him, probably because the accumulation of snow and ice had made normal entry impossible. The realization that his situation was severe enough to require specialized rescue equipment was both reassuring and terrifying. More voices joined the first, accompanied by the sounds of heavy equipment being positioned around his truck. Through the distorted acoustics of his frozen cab, he could hear fragments of professional conversation about body temperature, exposure time, and medical protocols for treating severe hypothermia. "How long has he been stranded?" asked a woman's voice that sounded like it might belong to a paramedic. "Dispatch shows initial contact around 3 p.m. yesterday," came the reply. "So maybe 16 hours in these conditions. Core temperature is probably dangerously low." 16 hours. Had it really been that long? Clarence's sense of time had become so distorted that the night might have lasted minutes or days. The mathematical reality of spending 2/3 of a day in sub-zero temperatures without heating made his survival seem improbable even to his hypothermia-addled thinking. The sound of power tools began outside his truck, probably some kind of cutting equipment designed to open vehicle doors that had been frozen shut or blocked by snow and ice. The noise was loud enough to penetrate his confused thoughts, providing an anchor to reality that helped him focus on the fact that rescue was actually happening rather than being another elaborate hallucination. "Driver, we're going to get you out of there," called the authoritative voice. "Just hang on a few more minutes." Hang on. The phrase seemed simultaneously encouraging and ominous. If professional rescuers were telling him to hang on, it suggested that his condition was critical enough that losing consciousness at this point might be fatal. Clarence tried to prepare himself for the rescue process, but his body wasn't responding normally to conscious commands. His hands wouldn't grip objects properly, his legs felt disconnected from his torso, and his thinking remained sluggish despite the adrenaline that should have been produced by the approaching rescue. The cutting sounds stopped, followed by the screech of metal against metal as rescuers worked to open his frozen cab door. Cold air, that was somehow even colder than the air inside his truck, rushed in through the opening, and Clarence realized that his body heat had managed to warm the enclosed space by a few precious degrees. "Jesus," said someone close to his ear. "He's hypothermic but responsive. Get the thermal blankets and call for helicopter transport." Hands in thick gloves began checking his pulse and examining his eyes with a small flashlight. The touch felt strange. He could sense the pressure but couldn't feel texture or temperature normally. His body's sensory systems had been compromised by hours of extreme cold exposure. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" asked the woman who'd spoken earlier. She was wearing the uniform of an emergency medical technician, and her breath formed clouds as she spoke. "Clarence," he managed to whisper. "Clarence Hutchins." "Good. Clarence, we're going to move you to our ambulance where it's warm. You're going to be okay, but we need to be very careful about how we warm you up. Your body temperature is extremely low." They wrapped him in what felt like silver blankets that crinkled when they moved, then carefully extracted him from his sleeper berth and placed him on some kind of stretcher. The movement was agonizing. His stiffened joints and muscles protested every change in position, and the transition from his confined space to the open air made him feel exposed and vulnerable. The ambulance was wonderfully warm, equipped with heating systems that began working on his hypothermia immediately. But the warming process was controlled and gradual. Apparently, rapid temperature changes could be as dangerous as the original cooling had been. "We're taking you to Albany Medical Center," explained the paramedic as she attached monitoring equipment to his chest. "They have a specialized hypothermia treatment unit. Your core temperature is 86 degrees, which is severe but survivable if we handle the rewarming correctly." 86 degrees. Normal body temperature was 98.6, which meant he'd lost more than 12 degrees of core warmth during his night in the frozen truck. The numbers helped explain why his thinking had become so confused and why his body had stopped responding normally to conscious control. As the ambulance began moving toward the hospital, Clarence found himself looking back at his Kenworth through the rear window. His truck looked like an artificial mountain rising from the snow, almost completely buried except for the top of his cab and the highest point of his trailer. It was hard to believe that something so massive could be so completely overwhelmed by natural forces. "Your truck will be fine," the paramedic assured him, noticing his concern. "State crews will dig it out once the storm passes completely. Right now, we need to focus on getting your body temperature back to normal." The rewarming process was more complex than simply applying heat. The medical team used heated blankets and warm intravenous fluids, but they monitored his heart rhythm constantly because rapid temperature changes could cause cardiac arrhythmias that might be fatal. His blood pressure and oxygen levels were also being tracked continuously. "The dangerous part isn't necessarily the cooling," explained Dr. Patricia Vance, the emergency physician who took charge of his case once they reached Albany Medical Center. "It's the rewarming. Your blood chemistry has been altered by the hypothermia, and we have to bring you back to normal very gradually to avoid shocking your cardiovascular system." As sensation slowly returned to his hands and feet, Clarence discovered that the rewarming process was almost as uncomfortable as the original cooling had been. His extremities burned and tingled with pins and needles sensations that were sometimes more painful than the numbness had been. More disturbing was the gradual return of clear thinking. As his brain warmed and normal blood flow resumed, he began to fully comprehend how close he'd come to dying alone in that frozen truck. The hallucinations that had seemed so real during the worst hours of hypothermia now felt like memories of a different person's experiences. "You were maybe 2 hours away from irreversible organ damage," Dr. Vance told him after reviewing his test results. "Another degree or two of core temperature loss, and we might not have been able to save you." 2 hours. The margin between survival and death had been incredibly narrow, measured in small increments of body temperature that his conscious mind couldn't directly control or monitor. During his recovery, other patients were brought into the emergency department with similar conditions. Motorists who'd been stranded by the same blizzard, an elderly man whose heating system had failed during the storm, a homeless person who'd been found unconscious in a downtown doorway. The winter storm had created a small epidemic of hypothermia cases throughout the region. The staff mentioned that several other truck drivers had been rescued from the same stretch of highway where Clarence had been stranded. Not all of them had survived. 2 drivers who'd been found in the afternoon, several hours after Clarence's rescue, had been dead when emergency crews reached them, apparently having succumbed to the cold sometime during the night. "The difference was probably that you maintained some level of consciousness and kept trying to stay active," Dr. Vance explained. "The drivers who didn't make it had apparently fallen asleep early in the process and never woke up." Sleep. The overwhelming urge to lose consciousness that he'd fought against throughout the night had literally been his body trying to kill him. His stubborn refusal to give in to that biological demand had been the difference between life and death. Martha arrived at the hospital on the second day of his recovery, having driven from Pittsburgh as soon as the roads reopened. She looked older than he remembered, more fragile, and seeing her made him realize how close she'd come to being a widow. "The dispatcher called yesterday morning when you missed your check-in," she explained, holding his hand while he sat up in his hospital bed. "I knew something was wrong because you'd never missed a call in 22 years of driving." 22 years. More than 2 decades of professional driving, and he'd nearly died because he'd underestimated a winter storm and overestimated his equipment's ability to protect him in extreme conditions. "I kept thinking about that cruise you wanted to take," he told her. "That bonus payment would have covered the whole trip." Martha smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. "We'll take the cruise anyway. Money's not as important as having you alive to enjoy it with." The load of industrial machinery was still in his trailer, probably frozen solid by now but undamaged by the cold. The customer had been understanding about the delayed delivery, and Clarence's insurance would cover the additional costs caused by the weather emergency. In purely financial terms, his near-death experience had been little more than an expensive inconvenience. But as his body temperature returned to normal and his thinking cleared completely, Clarence found himself questioning whether he wanted to continue long-haul trucking. The isolation that he'd always enjoyed, the solitude of the road, the independence of being his own boss, had nearly killed him when combined with weather conditions that overwhelmed his ability to handle problems alone. A lot of drivers retire after something like this, Dr. Vance mentioned during one of her daily checkups. The psychological impact of coming so close to death can make it difficult to feel safe in similar situations. She was right. Even thinking about driving through winter weather conditions made him feel anxious in ways that had nothing to do with rational risk assessment. The memory of lying helpless in that freezing cab, feeling his body slowly shutting down while he waited for help that might never come, would probably stay with him for the rest of his life. On his final day in the hospital, a woman named Hazel Peterson from the State Police Towing Division brought him forms to sign regarding the recovery of his truck. She was probably in her mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of matter-of-fact demeanor that suggested she'd dealt with plenty of weather-related trucking emergencies over the years. "Your Kenworth's in good shape, considering," she reported. "Some water damage from snow that melted and refroze inside the cab, and you'll need to have the electrical system checked before you try to start it. But structurally, everything looks fine." "How many other trucks were stranded out there?" Clarence asked. 47 along that stretch of I-380, plus maybe a dozen more on side roads and truck stops. We recovered 39 drivers alive." She paused, her expression becoming more somber. 8 didn't make it through the night. 8 drivers, men and women who'd made the same decision he had, to continue driving despite increasingly dangerous weather conditions, but who hadn't been as lucky or as stubborn about staying conscious during the critical hours. As Hazel collected his signature on the recovery paperwork, she mentioned something that stuck with him long after his discharge from the hospital. "The thing about winter storms," she said, "is that they don't care how experienced you are or how good your equipment is. When conditions get bad enough, survival becomes mostly about luck and the specific circumstances of where you end up stranded." Luck. After 22 years of believing that skill and preparation could handle any driving situation, Clarence had learned that some situations were simply beyond human control. His survival had depended more on random factors: the exact location where he'd gotten stuck, the timing of when rescue crews could reach him, even the specific characteristics of his truck's insulation, than on any conscious decisions he'd made. 3 weeks after his discharge from Albany Medical Center, Clarence found himself sitting in his recovered Kenworth at a truck stop outside Pittsburgh, staring at the weather report on his phone and trying to work up the courage to start the engine. The truck had been thoroughly inspected and repaired. The electrical system had been completely rebuilt, and his company had cleared him for return to active duty. But every time he looked at the forecast showing possible snow showers along his intended route, his hands began to tremble. The psychological impact of his near-death experience had been more severe than any of the physical effects. His body had recovered completely from the hypothermia. No frostbite, no permanent organ damage, no lasting cardiovascular problems. But his mind couldn't forget those hours of feeling his consciousness fragment as his body temperature dropped toward fatal levels. Martha had suggested retirement, and their financial situation made it possible. 22 years of steady income and careful savings had built a nest egg that could support them comfortably if he stopped working now. At 58, he was young enough to enjoy retirement, but old enough to have earned it through decades of professional driving. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," she'd told him that morning as he prepared to leave for what might be his final trucking run. "We've got enough money, and I'd rather have you alive and home than wealthy and dead on some highway." But something about walking away from trucking because of fear felt like surrendering to the trauma rather than recovering from it. He'd built his entire adult identity around being someone who could handle any driving situation. who could navigate through problems that defeated lesser drivers. Letting one bad night end his career seemed like admitting that he wasn't the person he'd believed himself to be. The load he'd accepted was deliberately chosen to minimize weather-related risks. Electronics from a distribution center in Pittsburgh to a retailer in Baltimore, a route that stayed in relatively temperate regions and could be completed in a single day with no overnight parking required. He'd checked the forecast obsessively, confirmed that no winter weather was predicted anywhere along his intended path. Still, when he turned the key and heard the familiar rumble of his rebuilt engine, Clarence felt a wave of anxiety that had nothing to do with rational risk assessment. The sound of air brakes releasing and the sensation of 40 tons of truck and trailer beginning to move triggered flashbacks to that night in the blizzard, memories of feeling helpless and abandoned while his body slowly froze. The first few miles were torture. Every cloud in the sky looked like it might produce snow. Every temperature reading on his dashboard seemed dangerously low. Every other truck he passed reminded him of the drivers who hadn't survived that January blizzard. His CB radio crackled with routine traffic, weather reports, fuel prices, speed trap warnings, but all he could hear were the desperate voices of stranded drivers calling for help that might come too late. By the time he reached the Maryland state line, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the comfortable temperature inside his heated cab. His hands ached from gripping the steering wheel too tightly, and his back was sore from sitting in a state of constant tension. The simple act of driving had become an exercise in managing panic rather than the peaceful solitude he'd enjoyed for more than 2 decades. At a rest stop near Frederick, he called Martha to check in, something he'd never felt compelled to do during routine daylight drives. "How are you holding up?" she asked, probably hearing the stress in his voice despite his attempts to sound normal. "It's harder than I expected," he admitted. "Keep thinking about that night. Keep waiting for something to go wrong. You could still turn around and come home. The load's not that important." The suggestion was tempting, but Clarence knew that if he gave up on this first trip back, he'd probably never find the courage to try again. His trucking career would end not with a conscious decision to retire, but with defeat by his own trauma-induced fears. "I'm going to finish the run," he said, "but I think this might be my last one." The remainder of the trip to Baltimore was completed without incident. No mechanical problems, no weather issues, no traffic delays that would require overnight parking. The customer received their electronics on schedule. The paperwork was processed normally, and Clarence found himself with a successful delivery that proved his equipment and skills were still fully functional. But the psychological toll of fighting anxiety for 8 hours straight left him exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. As he drove the empty trailer back toward Pittsburgh, he realized that he'd spent the entire day in a state of hypervigilance that was unsustainable for long-term trucking. The sun was setting as he pulled into the terminal where he'd started that morning, painting the Pennsylvania sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of better times when driving had been a source of pleasure rather than stress. Other drivers were beginning their evening runs, checking their equipment and planning routes through the night hours that had once been his favorite time to drive. Melvin Garrett, the dispatcher who'd coordinated emergency services during the blizzard, was working the evening shift at the terminal. He recognized Clarence immediately and approached his truck as he was completing his post-trip inspection. "Good to see you back on the road," Melvin said, though his expression suggested he understood the psychological challenges Clarence was facing. "How did it feel being out there again?" "Like I was waiting for something terrible to happen," Clarence replied honestly. "Kept expecting to get trapped again, even though the weather was perfect and I was never more than an hour from shelter." Melvin nodded with the understanding of someone who'd dealt with numerous trauma cases over the years. "I've seen a lot of drivers struggle after serious emergencies. Some never get past it. Some take time to rebuild their confidence. There's no shame in either outcome." That evening,
Clarence sat at his kitchen table with Martha, reviewing their financial situation one more time. The numbers confirmed what they'd calculated before. They could afford to retire immediately if he chose to stop driving. His trucking income wouldn't be missed if they adjusted their spending slightly and relied more heavily on their investment accounts. "What do you want to do?" Martha asked, though her preference was clear from the relief in her voice when he'd walked through the door that evening. "I think I want to try a few more local runs," Clarence said. "Maybe shorter hauls where I'm always close to home. See if I can work through the anxiety gradually." Over the next several months, he accepted only day trips within 100 miles of Pittsburgh, loads that could be completed in normal business hours with no possibility of overnight parking. The work paid less than his previous long-haul runs, but it allowed him to slowly rebuild his confidence while minimizing exposure to the weather conditions that triggered his trauma responses. Some days were better than others. Clear, warm weather brought back glimpses of the satisfaction he'd once found in professional driving. But whenever clouds gathered or temperatures dropped below freezing, he found himself fighting the same panic reactions that had plagued his first trip back. The breakthrough came 6 months later, during a routine delivery to a construction site in West Virginia. A sudden thunderstorm forced him to park for 2 hours, while heavy rain and lightning made driving unsafe. But instead of panic, he felt only normal caution about hazardous conditions. "I sat there listening to the rain on my cab roof," he told Martha that evening. "And for the first time since the blizzard, being alone in my truck felt comfortable instead of terrifying." The psychological recovery was gradual and incomplete. Even a year later, winter weather still triggered anxiety responses that made cold weather driving unpleasant rather than routine. But he'd learned to manage the symptoms well enough to continue working, accepting that his relationship with trucking had been permanently changed by that January night in the frozen cab. He never returned to long-haul driving. The isolation that had once been appealing now felt dangerous, and the unpredictability of weather conditions across multiple states made route planning feel like Russian roulette. Instead, he built a successful regional business handling deliveries within a day's drive of home, working with customers who understood his weather-related limitations. The Kenworth that had nearly become his tomb was eventually sold to another driver. Clarence couldn't bring himself to spend long hours in the cab where he'd experienced those terrifying hallucinations and felt his body shutting down degree by degree. The truck held too many memories of mortality and helplessness. On the second anniversary of the blizzard, local news stations ran retrospective stories about the storm that had killed 13 people throughout the region, including those 8 truck drivers who'd been stranded along the same highway where Clarence had fought for his life. He was interviewed for one of the reports, asked to describe his experience and what lessons other drivers might learn from it. "The main thing," he told the reporter, "is that you can't depend on equipment or experience to protect you when conditions get extreme enough. Sometimes survival comes down to luck and the specific circumstances of where you end up stranded." The interview concluded with a question about whether he had any regrets about his decision to continue driving despite weather warnings. Clarence considered the question carefully before responding. "I regret that other drivers died that night while I lived. I regret that families lost fathers and mothers because we all made the same mistake about our ability to handle extreme conditions. But I don't regret surviving. And I don't regret learning that there are limits to human control over natural forces." After the interview, as he drove his local route through the Pennsylvania countryside on a warm spring day, Clarence found himself thinking about those 8 drivers who hadn't made it through that January night. He wondered if they'd experienced the same hallucinations and false sensations of warmth that had tormented his final hours in the frozen cab. He wondered if they'd fought as hard to stay conscious, or if they'd surrendered more easily to the sleep that had felt so appealing. Most of all, he wondered why he'd survived when others hadn't,
and whether the margin between life and death had really been as random as everyone suggested. The thought that his survival might have been pure chance rather than any kind of personal strength or preparedness was both humbling and disturbing. But as the miles passed beneath his wheels and the familiar rhythm of highway driving gradually relaxed the tension he still carried in his shoulders, Clarence realized that the specific reasons for his survival were less important than what he'd chosen to do with the life that had been returned to him. He was still driving, still contributing to the economy that depended on freight movement, still finding purpose in the work that had defined his adult identity. The trauma would always be part of him now, a permanent alteration in how he experienced the world. But it hadn't destroyed him, and on days like this, when the weather was good and the roads were clear and he was heading home to Martha at the end of a successful day, he could almost believe that surviving that frozen night had been worthwhile.